Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet space we share together in the deepest hours of the night. I'm so glad you found your way here, to this gentle story crafted especially for those moments when sleep feels just beyond reach, when your mind continues its endless circling, and you need something soft to anchor your thoughts, something to carry you gently across that threshold between waking and dreaming. Tonight, we journey together to Victorian London, to the most famous address in all the world of mystery and detection, to a place where gaslight flickers against worn wallpaper, and the scent of pipe tobacco mingles with the aroma of Mrs. Hudson's tea. This is a story designed to help you release the tensions of your day, to slow your breathing, to quiet those persistent thoughts that keep you from the rest you deserve. There's no urgency here, no deadline to meet, nothing you must remember or accomplish. Simply let yourself be carried along by the words, by the atmosphere, by the gentle unfolding of a mystery that asks nothing of you except your presence. Before we begin, I'm curious, though you needn't answer aloud. Where in this wide world are you listening from tonight? Are you tucked beneath blankets in a room you've known for years? Or are you somewhere new, somewhere temporary? Are the sounds of rain or wind accompanying our journey? Or is your night filled with the peculiar silence that comes only in the deepest hours? Wherever you are, whatever brought you here tonight, you are exactly where you need to be. And this story is for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain falls softly upon London tonight, as it has fallen for 3 days without ceasing, a persistent whisper against window panes and cobblestones, against the slate roofs of 10,000 buildings pressed close together in the great sprawling darkness of the city. It is the kind of rain that belongs to autumn's deepest heart, neither violent nor brief, but steady and inexorable, turning the streets into rivers of reflected gaslight, transforming every surface into a mirror that shows you a world slightly distorted, slightly more mysterious than the one you thought you knew. The sound it makes is neither loud nor silent, but something perfectly between, a continuous susurration that fills the spaces between other sounds, that becomes, after a time, less something you hear than something you feel in your bones, a presence as tangible as the dampness that creeps through even the thickest walls. At 221 B. Baker Street, in a sitting room on the first floor, a fire burns low in the grate, its flames having settled into that perfect state of being, neither urgently hungry nor nearly extinguished, but glowing with a steady warmth that asks no tending, that simply exists in companionable silence with those who share its space. The coals pulse with a deep orange-red light, occasionally shifting with the softest of sounds, a gentle settling that sends tiny sparks floating upward like earthbound stars seeking their celestial home. The room itself seems to breathe with the fire's rhythm, shadows expanding and contracting along the walls where they dance across the accumulated evidence of habitation. The overflowing bookshelves with their leather-bound volumes arranged in no order that any eye but one could discern. The cluttered mantelpiece where correspondence sits pinned with a jackknife beside a Turkish slipper, holding tobacco, the gasogene and the spirit case, the violin in its case resting against the Persian slipper, the scientific apparatus on the side table with its beakers and retorts, catching the firelight in their curved glass surfaces. Doctor. John Watson sits in his familiar armchair, the one positioned nearest the fire and slightly to the left, the one whose cushions have long since conformed to his particular shape, whose arms bear the slight wear marks from years of his hands, resting there precisely so. He holds a book, though he has not turned a page in some time, his attention drawn instead to the window where rain traces intricate patterns down the glass, each droplet following gravity's inexorable pull, while simultaneously seeming to possess its own particular character, its own intention. His eyes, those steady eyes that have witnessed so much strangeness and solved so many puzzles in the company of his singular friend, reflect the firelight as he gazes not quite at the rain, not quite at his own reflection, but at some middle distance where thought becomes visible if you know how to look. The hour is late, well past midnight, moving into that territory of time that belongs neither to one day nor fully to the next, when London's usual cacophony has diminished to occasional sounds. The distant rattle of a late hansom cab, the watchman's call from streets away, the settling of old buildings into their nightly rest. Mrs. Hudson has long since retired to her rooms below, though not before ensuring, as she always does, that the fire was properly banked and a fresh pot of tea left warming beside the hearth, because she knows, as all who know them well know, that sleep comes irregularly to the residents of 221B, and tea is always wanted at whatever hour wakefulness occurs. Watson shifts slightly in his chair, careful not to disturb the comfortable weight of the blanket across his knees, a concession to the dampness that has seeped into his old war wound, making it ache with that particular quality of pain that is not quite sharp, but not quite dull, simply present, like an old acquaintance who never knows when to leave. He considers returning to his book, a rather dense treatise on the criminal tribes of India that has proven more soporific than informative, but instead finds his attention drawn across the room to where the other chair sits empty. Sherlock Holmes has been absent for 3 weeks. This absence, Watson reflects, with the particular mixture of concern and resignation that has become second nature over their years of friendship, is not unusual in its occurrence, but perhaps slightly unusual in its duration. Holmes's habits have always included periodic disappearances, ventures into the underworld of London, where even Watson's loyal companionship cannot follow, investigations that require such complete transformation of identity that the presence of a former army doctor would shatter the carefully constructed disguise. Watson has learned, slowly and not without difficulty, to accept these absences, to trust that his friend will return when the work is complete, sometimes triumphant, sometimes morose, always exhausted in that particular way, that suggests days without proper food or sleep, the kind of weariness that goes deeper than mere physical fatigue. But 3 weeks is a long time, even by Holmes's standards. Watson sets his book aside, the movement slow and deliberate, and reaches for the teapot, grateful for its continued warmth. The act of pouring tea is one that has become so familiar over the years that his hands perform it almost without conscious direction. The slight tilt of the pot, the sound of liquid meeting china, with that particular musical quality that differs subtly with every vessel, the rising steam carrying the scent of leaves harvested halfway around the world and brought here to comfort gentlemen in a London night. He adds no milk, no sugar, preferring at this hour the pure taste of the tea itself, slightly bitter, slightly sweet, complex in ways that shift with each sip as the liquid cools from the first burning heat to something more temperate, more contemplative. The cup warms his hands, and he wraps his fingers around its circumference, feeling the heat seep into his palms, up his wrists, spreading through him in a way that seems to reach places the fire cannot. He raises the cup to his lips and drinks slowly, mindfully, letting each swallow anchor him in this moment, in this room, in this particular point of existence, where worry has not yet become genuine alarm, but hovers somewhere close, a presence felt but not yet acknowledged. From somewhere deep within the building comes a sound, the creak of old wood settling, or perhaps merely the building's bones adjusting to the weight of accumulated rain, the increased dampness in every timber and beam. These old structures have their own language, their own vocabulary of sounds that speak to those who listen, who have lived within their walls long enough to distinguish between ordinary settling and something that warrants attention. Watson's ear, trained by years of sudden nocturnal consultations and unexpected visitors, catches the sound and evaluates it automatically. Nothing to concern, merely the house speaking to itself in the vocabulary of age and weather. He drinks his tea and watches the rain, and does not, precisely, worry. But he holds space for the possibility of worry should it become necessary. The fire shifts again, a log collapsing into the heart of the coals with a soft sigh, sending up a small fountain of sparks that dance their brief incandescent dance before winking out into darkness. The flames, momentarily disturbed, flare up with renewed energy, casting new shadows that stretch across the ceiling like grasping fingers before settling once more into their steady rhythm. Watson watches this transformation with the part of his mind that watches everything, the observing part that Holmes once told him was his greatest gift as a chronicler, not his ability to write with particular elegance or narrative skill, but his capacity to notice the small things, the domestic details, the human moments that give context to the extraordinary events they so often find themselves entangled within. A clock somewhere in the house chimes the half hour, a single, clear note that resonates through the quiet, marking the passage of time without insistence, simply noting the world's continued rotation, the inexorable progression from one moment to the next. 1:30 in the morning then. Watson considers retiring to his bedroom, the small chamber he has maintained here, even after his marriage, after his return to private practice, because 221B has never ceased to be home, in a way that transcends mere residence. But something keeps him in his chair, some quality of the night that suggests waiting, though for what he cannot quite articulate. The rain continues its endless whispering against the windows, against the roof, against all of London's sleeping surfaces. Somewhere far away, a dog barks once, then falls silent. The fire breathes its steady warmth into the room. Watson's eyes grow heavy, the book forgotten beside him, the tea cooling in his hands, and he allows himself to drift into that state between waking and sleeping, where thoughts become less linear, more associative, where the boundary between memory and imagination grows pleasantly blurred. And then he hears it. Footsteps. Not from the street below, not from Mrs. Hudson's rooms, but from the stairs, ascending with a tread so familiar that Watson's body recognizes it before his mind fully registers what he's hearing. Not rapid footsteps suggesting urgency, not slow steps suggesting injury or exhaustion, but something between, measured, deliberate, the pace of a man deep in thought, working through some problem even as he climbs. Each footfall lands with precision, neither heavy nor light, but perfectly calibrated, the sound of someone who moves through space with complete awareness of how they occupy it. Watson sets down his teacup with hands that remain perfectly steady, because he has learned over years of sudden emergencies not to spill tea no matter what crisis presents itself, and rises from his chair just as the door opens and Sherlock Holmes steps into the room. For a moment, neither man speaks. Holmes stands in the doorway, one hand still on the doorknob, and Watson can catalogue in an instant what this glance reveals. The clothes of a labourer, rough wool and worn corduroy, mud spattered to the knee, and bearing the particular stains of travel by both rail and foot. His face is obscured by several days' growth of beard, but the eyes, those remarkable eyes that seem to absorb and calculate everything they fall upon, shine with an intensity that Watson recognizes as the light of successful investigation, of puzzles solved and mysteries penetrated. He is thin, perhaps thinner than when he left, but not dangerously so, and though weariness shows in the set of his shoulders, there is also a satisfaction, a completion that speaks of work well done. "Watson," Holmes says finally, his voice hoarse from disuse, or perhaps from speaking in whatever character he has been inhabiting. "I apologize for the lateness of the hour." "Holmes," Watson replies, and finds that this single word contains everything that needs saying: relief, welcome, mild reproach, affection, all compressed into those two syllables. Holmes steps fully into the room and closes the door behind him, with a gentleness that suggests awareness of the sleeping household below. He moves toward the fire with the economy of motion that characterizes all his physical actions. Nothing wasted, nothing superfluous, and for a long moment simply stands before the hearth, holding his hands toward the warmth with a sigh that speaks of cold journeys and nights spent in places less comfortable than this familiar room. "You've been in Cornwall," Watson says, because certain deductions present themselves, obviously even to his less remarkable powers of observation. The particular mud, the salt-stained clothing, the faint scent of fish and seaweed that accompanies his friend's presence. "The coast near Tintagel," Holmes confirms, a slight smile touching his lips at Watson's deduction, the kind of smile that acknowledges his friend's attempt, while simultaneously suggesting that much more could be gleaned from the same evidence. A peculiar business involving the disappearance of 3 fishermen, a ruined castle, and what the locals insisted was the return of Arthurian spirits seeking vengeance for some ancient wrong. "And was it?" Watson asks, settling back into his chair and gesturing for Holmes to take his own seat, reaching for the teapot even as he speaks, because the ritual of tea is one that marks transitions, that transforms the space between departure and return into something manageable. "Spirits? No. 3 fishermen engaged in smuggling, who found their operation compromised and elected to stage their own supernatural disappearance while they relocated to more hospitable waters. Yes." Holmes sheds his rough coat and drapes it over the back of his chair with a weariness that suggests he has been wearing it for days without pause. "Though I confess the castle was atmospheric enough to almost warrant supernatural intervention. The wind off the sea makes the most extraordinary sounds through those ruined chambers, particularly at night when the tide is high. I spent one night in the ruins observing, and even I, with my rational faculties fully engaged, could understand how the credulous might imagine ancient voices in those stones. He sinks into his chair with a gratitude that is visible in every line of his body, the tension that has held him upright through whatever trials the investigation required finally releasing. Now that he is home, now that the familiar surroundings give him permission to cease performing whatever role he has been playing and simply be himself again. Watson pours tea without comment, adding the exact amount of milk and sugar that Holmes prefers, a knowledge so deeply embedded that his hands move automatically through the familiar motions. "You've been worried," Holmes observes, accepting the cup with hands that show evidence of manual labor. Scraped knuckles, broken nails, the kind of damage that comes from hauling nets or climbing rocks, from being someone other than a gentleman detective. "Not worried," Watson corrects gently, "merely aware of your absence." "A fine distinction," Holmes says, and drinks deeply, his eyes closing briefly in appreciation of the simple comfort of hot tea after cold nights and irregular meals. "But I thank you for it nonetheless. The case required complete immersion, complete transformation. For 3 weeks, I was Thomas Morton, a fisherman recently arrived from Dover seeking work. A man with a reputation for silence and hard work. Someone peripheral enough to observe without attracting suspicion. Present enough to be included in the casual conversations where truth leaks out slowly, in fragments and half admissions." Watson listens, watching the way the firelight plays across his friend's features, noting the exhaustion that lies beneath the satisfaction, the price that such complete transformation always exacts. Holmes continues, his voice falling into that rhythmic pattern of retrospective narration that Watson has learned signals the need to process, to verbalize, to transform experience into narrative as a way of returning to himself. The smuggling operation was ingenious, I must admit. They were using the caves beneath the ruins, accessible only at low tide, and only then if you know which passages lead somewhere, and which merely circle back upon themselves, or dead-end in collapsed chambers. The local legends about spirits and ancient curses served as excellent protection. No one ventured near the ruins after dark, particularly not when strange lights could be seen moving through the upper chambers, lights which were, of course, merely signals for boats approaching from France, carrying brandy and tobacco, occasionally information for those willing to pay for it. He pauses, drinking more tea, and Watson refills his cup before it's fully empty, maintaining the flow of warmth and comfort. Outside, the rain continues its steady presence, but somehow its sound seems different now, less lonely, less like waiting, and more like companionship, as though the night itself has relaxed with Holmes's return. The 3 fishermen staged their disappearance with remarkable attention to detail. Holmes continues, his voice growing slower, softer, settling into the late-night rhythms that allow for both story and sleep, for consciousness and its gradual surrender. They left their boats properly secured, their homes showing no signs of struggle, but they also left small peculiarities. A boot print in a place no boot should logically be, a rope tied with a knot unknown to local fishermen, an oilskin coat found draped across a stone that legend claims was Arthur's throne. Each detail designed to suggest the supernatural, to push investigation away from rational explanation and toward superstition. But not successfully, Watson murmurs, his own eyes growing heavy with the warmth of the fire and the lateness of the hour, and the deep comfort of familiar companionship restored. Not successfully, Holmes agrees, because they could not account for the fundamental truth that humans leave traces, always and inevitably. No matter how carefully we attempt to obscure our passage, we disturb the world around us in ways that can be read by those who know how to look. Thomas Morton looked and observed, and eventually earned enough trust to be invited into the conspiracy himself, at which point the matter became merely one of communicating with the local constabulary and arranging for arrest to be made at a moment that would secure both the smugglers and their French contacts. He falls silent, and Watson knows the story is complete, or at least complete enough for tonight. The details will emerge later in subsequent conversations, in the careful writing up that will transform these events into one more chronicle of Holmes's peculiar genius. But for now, this is sufficient. The outline sketched, the ending revealed, the work completed and put aside so that rest can be claimed. "You should sleep," Watson says quietly, though he makes no move to rise from his own chair, and Holmes makes no move toward his bedroom. "Soon," Holmes replies, and his voice has grown softer still, dreamy almost, the sharp edges of his consciousness blunting with exhaustion and warmth. "First, I simply need to be here, to remember what it feels like to be myself again, rather than Thomas Morton, to sit in a chair that knows my shape, to drink tea that tastes as it should, rather than the bitter brew that working men drink, to be in the presence of someone who knows me and requires no performance." And so they sit, these two men who have shared so many strange adventures, so many late nights and inexplicable cases, simply existing in comfortable silence, while the fire burns and the rain falls and London sleeps around them. Time moves differently in such moments, neither fast nor slow, but suspended somehow, as though the ordinary rules that govern progression from one second to the next have been temporarily relaxed, allowing this moment to expand and fill whatever space is needed. Watson's eyes drift closed, then open, then close again, each time staying shut a little longer, the border between waking and sleeping growing increasingly porous. He is aware of Holmes's presence in the way one is aware of breathing or heartbeat, not through conscious attention, but through some deeper sense that registers essential patterns, that knows when the rhythm changes or ceases. He hears, or perhaps dreams he hears, Holmes setting down his empty cup, the slight creak of the chair as his friend shifts position, the tiny sounds of settling into rest. The fire crackles softly, a log breaking apart at its heart and reforming into new configurations of heat and light. Rain whispers against glass. The house breathes around them, old wood and older stone expanding and contracting with temperature's subtle shifts. These sounds blend into a symphony of domestic comfort, the kind of soundscape that speaks to the deepest parts of the brain, the primitive centers that determine safety and danger, that allow the body to release its vigilance and permit sleep's approach. "Watson," Holmes murmurs from his chair, his voice barely above a whisper, already half submerged in sleep's incoming tide. "Yes? It's good to be home." "Yes," Watson agrees, and feels himself smiling in the darkness behind his closed eyelids. "It is." And then, for a time, there is only the sound of rain and fire, and two men breathing in the synchronized rhythm of deep rest, in the oldest house in Baker Street, in the heart of sleeping London, while the night continues its patient progression toward dawn. When Watson wakes, the grey light of morning has begun to filter through the windows, softening the darkness without yet dispelling it entirely. creating that peculiar in-between illumination that belongs only to London's rainy mornings. When the sun rises somewhere behind layers of cloud so thick that sunrise becomes less an event than a gradual lightening, a slow shift from black to grey to a pale luminescence that suggests, rather than declares, the day's arrival. The fire has burned down to embers, their glow faint but still present. And someone, Mrs. Hudson undoubtedly, has left a fresh pot of tea on the table beside his chair, covered with a cosy to maintain its warmth, along with a plate of bread and butter and cold meat. Breakfast arranged with the understanding that neither resident is likely to desire conversation or formal dining at whatever hour they might wake. Watson stretches carefully, his back protesting the night spent in the chair rather than his bed, his old wound announcing its presence with that familiar ache. He pours tea, grateful beyond measure for Mrs. Hudson's thoughtfulness, and glances across at Holmes's chair, expecting to find his friend still sleeping. But the chair is empty, the cushion still bearing the indentation of recent occupation, but no longer holding its occupant. He eats his simple breakfast slowly, savouring the ordinariness of it, the profound comfort of bread and butter and tea in familiar surroundings with familiar sounds. The rain has diminished to a drizzle, its sound against the windows more suggestion than statement, and through the grey light he can see the street below beginning to wake. A milk cart passing, its bottles rattling rhythmically, a maid across the way opening shutters, a constable on his rounds, his regular tread marking the morning's progression. The violin falls silent, and a moment later Holmes emerges from his bedroom, transformed. Gone are the rough clothes and labourer's beard, replaced by his familiar mouse-coloured dressing gown, his hair damp from washing, his face clean-shaven, and showing clearly the sharp angles of his features, the penetrating intelligence of those remarkable grey eyes. He looks, Watson thinks, more himself than he has in the brief hours since his return, as though the removal of Thomas Morton's physical appearance has completed the removal of Thomas Morton's presence, allowing Sherlock Holmes to fully re-inhabit his own identity. "Good morning, Watson," Holmes says, moving to the breakfast tray and examining its contents with the critical eye of a man who has been too long without proper nutrition and is now remembering what hunger feels like when separated from the urgency of a case requiring attention. Mrs. Hudson is a treasure beyond price. She is indeed, Watson agrees, though I suspect she'll have words for you about your appearance when she sees you've returned. You're thinner than when you left. The life of a Cornish fisherman does not include the regular meals to which we've become accustomed. Holmes says mildly, constructing a sandwich with focused attention, layering meat and butter with the same precision he brings to all tasks, large or small. But I shall make amends. For today, at least, I have no cases requiring immediate attention, no urgent consultations, no mysteries that cannot wait while I reacquaint myself with the comforts of civilization. He carries his plate to his chair and settles into it with visible relief, eating with the unself-conscious focus of genuine hunger rather than mere social obligation. Watson watches him, noting the way tension continues to leach out of his frame, the way his shoulders drop incrementally with each minute back in familiar surroundings, and feels satisfaction at having maintained this space, this refuge for his friend's return. They eat in comfortable silence, the kind that requires no filling, no social performance, simply two men sharing a meal in the grey morning light, while London wakes around them. The street sounds gradually increase. More carts, voices calling greetings, the rattle of shop shutters being raised, the complex symphony of a great city beginning its daily business. But inside 221B, time moves more slowly, preserved in this quiet pocket where the night's rest has not quite fully yielded to the day's demands. Holmes finishes his meal and leans back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the window, where rain still traces its lazy patterns down the glass. "I had forgotten," he says quietly, "how pleasant it is to simply sit, to have no role to perform, no character to maintain, no constant vigilance required. For 3 weeks, I was never not Thomas Morton, not even in sleep, because Thomas Morton and Sherlock Holmes sleep differently, move differently, respond to the world differently. The complete inhabitation of a character requires that there be no cracks, no moments where the true self shows through." "It sounds exhausting," Watson observes. "It is," Holmes acknowledges, "and yet it is also necessary, and in its own way, satisfying." The work could not have been accomplished as Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective from London. The smugglers would never have spoken freely in such a presence, would have revealed nothing of value. But Thomas Morton, simple fisherman, unambitious and taciturn, reliable with his hands and unburdened by curiosity, such a man they could trust, could speak around without concern, could eventually include in their conspiracy. He falls silent, his gaze still on the window, and Watson can see him working through something, processing some element of the experience that has not yet been fully articulated. The violin has given him the space to think, and now words must complete what music began. "There is something humbling," Holmes continues slowly, "about inhabiting another life so completely, about understanding through embodiment rather than observation how differently the world presents itself when you occupy a different position within it." Thomas Morton's concerns were not Sherlock Holmes's concerns. He worried about the state of his nets, about the price of fish at market, about whether the weather would hold for the next day's work. His pleasures were simpler: a pipe at day's end, a pint at the local tavern, the respect of other men who judged him by his work rather than his intellect. There is a peace in that simplicity, a freedom in the narrowing of focus to immediate, tangible matters. "But it is not your life," Watson says gently. "No," Holmes agrees. "It is not my life, and I would not wish it to be permanently. But 3 weeks of it has given me something, a perspective, perhaps, or simply a reminder that there are many ways to be human, many paths that lead to satisfaction and meaning, and the one I have chosen, while suited to my particular gifts, is not the only valid path, nor necessarily the superior one." Watson considers this, understanding that beneath the philosophical musing lies exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes not just from physical exertion, but from the effort of sustaining a complex deception for weeks on end. "You need rest," he says firmly, "proper rest, in a proper bed, for more than a few hours stolen in a chair." "I do," Holmes acknowledges without argument, which in itself signals the depth of his fatigue. The Sherlock Holmes of even yesterday would have claimed to be perfectly fit, would have insisted that rest was unnecessary, would have found some task requiring immediate attention. But first, I wanted to sit here, in this chair, with you in yours, and remember what this feels like. The Cornish coast is beautiful in its way, wild and harsh and honest, but it is not home. The word hangs in the air between them, invested with all the meaning that neither man would typically attach to such things, both having lost their original homes, their families, the places and people that first defined them, but having found, in this cluttered sitting room above Baker Street, something that serves the same essential purpose, a place of safety, of authenticity, of being fully oneself without performance or pretense. Then sit, Watson says quietly. Rest here as long as you need. The world will continue without our immediate intervention. Holmes smiles, a genuine smile that reaches his eyes and softens the usually sharp angles of his face. The world has a tendency toward crisis, he observes. But yes, for today, others can manage its problems. Today belongs to tea and fire, and the particular pleasure of having nowhere to be except exactly where we are. And so the morning passes in gentle domesticity, in the reading of newspapers and the slow consumption of more tea, in comfortable silence punctuated by occasional observations about the rain's pattern or some item in the news. Mrs. Hudson appears at one point, her face breaking into a smile at the sight of Holmes returned. And if she has sharp words about his appearance, or his irregular habits of vanishing without notice, she keeps them to herself, simply ensuring that more food is brought up, that the fire is properly tended, that her peculiar tenants have what they need to recover from whatever strange business has kept them absent or worried. The rain continues its gentle patter, sometimes strengthening to a proper downpour that drums against the windows with more insistence, sometimes fading to almost nothing, just the barest suggestion of moisture in the air. The light never quite decides whether to commit to full day or retreat back into dusk, but hovers in that grey in-between that makes time feel suspended, as though this day exists outside the normal progression of hours, a gift of extra time stolen from the ordinary flow. Eventually, inevitably, Holmes's eyes begin to close, despite his attempts to remain conversational, his responses growing slower and less sharp, his questions trailing off into silence. Watson watches this progression with fond concern, waiting for the moment when stubbornness will yield to necessity, when his friend will finally acknowledge what his body has been insisting for hours. "Holmes," he says gently, and those remarkable eyes open, though they focus with difficulty. "Go to bed, properly to bed, not sleeping in a chair. The mysteries of the world will wait." For a moment, it seems Holmes might argue, might insist that he's perfectly comfortable where he is, but then he nods slowly and rises with visible effort. "You are, as always, the voice of reason," he says, his words slightly slurred with exhaustion. "I shall follow your prescription, Doctor, and trust in the healing power of rest." He makes his way toward his bedroom with the careful precision of someone navigating by will rather than full consciousness. And Watson watches until the door closes, then listens as the familiar sounds filter through, the creak of the bed accepting weight, the slight rustling of blankets being arranged, then silence. Watson remains in his chair, watching the rain and the grey light, feeling the weight of the night's lost sleep, but not yet ready to seek his own bed, content instead to simply sit in this quiet space and know that all is as it should be, that whatever strange adventures await in the days ahead, for this moment, this day, there is only peace and rest, and the sound of rain against old glass. The afternoon deepens into evening so gradually that Watson cannot identify the moment of transition, the grey light simply darkening by degrees until he realizes he must light the lamps if he wishes to continue reading, though the book in his lap has long since ceased to hold his attention, serving instead merely as something for his hands to hold, a prop that allows him to sit and think without the need for other occupation. He rises, careful not to disturb the profound quiet that has settled over the rooms, and moves about the sitting room, lighting the gas lamps one by one, each small flame blooming behind its glass shade, and adding its warm glow to the gathering darkness. The fire has burned down again, and he adds coal carefully, mindful of the sounds, the slight scrape of the scuttle, the soft fall of fuel onto embers, the gradual catch and spread of flames as new material begins to burn. These domestic tasks feel like meditation, like prayers said in the temple of ordinary life, each small action a conscious choice to maintain warmth, light, comfort in the face of darkness and cold. There is satisfaction in this maintenance, in the careful tending of space, and Watson understands more fully why Mrs. Hudson performs these tasks with such dedication, such attention to detail. They are not merely chores, but acts of care, of creating refuge, of holding back the chaos that always presses against the thin boundaries of order we construct. The rain has settled into a steady rhythm again, neither increasing nor diminishing, simply present as it has been present for days now, as though London has been transported to some more tropical climate, where monsoons last for weeks, where the sky simply opens and does not close again until some mysterious condition has been satisfied, some quota of water delivered to the thirsting earth. But Watson finds he does not mind the rain, not really. There is something soothing about its constancy, something that speaks to persistence and continuance, to patterns that repeat regardless of human notice or concern. From Holmes's room comes no sound at all, the deep silence of exhausted sleep, and Watson feels a kind of parental satisfaction at this, at having ensured his friend's rest through the simple expedient of being present, of maintaining the space, of gently insisting that care for the body is not weakness, but wisdom. How many times, he wonders, has he played this role, the keeper of mundane necessities, while Holmes's brilliant mind ranges across mysteries and deductions? It is not a role he resents, quite the opposite. There is profound purpose in being the tether that keeps genius connected to the ordinary needs of human existence, the reminder that even the most remarkable mind inhabits a body that requires food, rest, warmth. He returns to his chair with a fresh cup of tea and simply sits, watching the flames and listening to the rain, letting his own thoughts drift without direction or destination. This, he thinks, is what peace feels like. Not the absence of all concern, not perpetual happiness or uninterrupted pleasure, but simply this: a warm room, a comfortable chair, rain on the windows, the knowledge that those in one's care are safe and sleeping, that the immediate future holds no urgent demands, that one has permission to simply exist without purpose beyond existing. Time passes, the lamps burn steadily, the fire breathes its ancient rhythm. Outside, London continues its complex dance of millions of lives, intersecting and diverging. But inside 221B, there is only stillness and quiet, and the gentle passage of hours that ask nothing except to be witnessed. Watson's eyes drift closed, his head settling back against the chair's worn upholstery, and he allows himself to slip into that pleasant state between waking and sleeping, where consciousness continues, but loses its sharp edges, where thoughts flow like water rather than marching in orderly lines, where time becomes irrelevant and space contracts to the small sphere of warmth and comfort defined by the chair and the fire and the sound of rain. He is aware, in some distant way, of footsteps on the stairs, Mrs. Hudson bringing more tea, undoubtedly, or coal for the fire, her movements so familiar that they register as comfort rather than intrusion. He hears, or dreams he hears, the soft clink of china, the gentle sound of the door closing again. But these sounds integrate seamlessly into his drifting state, becoming part of the symphony of domestic life that underlies all else. And then, from somewhere beyond the immediate comfort of the sitting room, comes a sound that is not part of the familiar pattern. A knock at the street door below, sharp and urgent. The kind of knock that announces crisis or emergency, that demands immediate attention and will not be ignored. Watson's eyes open fully, his body automatically tensing, years of responding to urgent summons asserting themselves. Despite the comfort and warmth that surrounds him, he hears Mrs. Hudson's voice, muffled by distance and floorboards, responding to whoever stands in the rain at the door. He cannot make out words, but the tone is clear. Concern, perhaps confusion, the voice of someone whose ordinary evening has been interrupted by the unexpected. Footsteps ascend the stairs, multiple sets, Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread, and another, heavier, more uncertain. Watson rises from his chair and moves to the sitting room door, opening it just as Mrs. Hudson reaches the landing, her face flushed from the stairs, and worry evident in her eyes. "Dr. Watson," she says, slightly breathless. "There's a young man here. Says it's urgent. Says he must speak with Mr. Holmes immediately. I told him Mr. Holmes was resting and could not be disturbed, but he's most insistent. Says it's a matter of life and death." Behind her on the landing stands a young man. No, Watson corrects his initial impression. Not quite a man, perhaps 18 or 19, that awkward age between boy and adult, where one can be either depending on circumstances. He is soaked through despite an oilskin coat, water dripping from his hair and running in rivulets down his face, his eyes wide with what Watson's experienced assessment identifies as genuine terror, not theatrical, but real, the kind of fear that comes from confronting something beyond one's understanding or ability to manage. "It's about my sister," the young man says, his voice breaking slightly, hovering in that uncertain register that might plunge into either tears or desperate control. "She's gone missing, disappeared from a locked room, and the village says it's the Morrigan, the death goddess, that she's been taken as sacrifice because of what our father did, because of the old ways that he violated. But my father says it's nonsense, says there's a rational explanation, and if there's anyone who can find one, it's Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Please, I've travelled all day to get here. I have money for his fee, whatever it costs. But please, you must help me. She's only 16, and she's been gone 2 days, and every hour that passes." His voice breaks entirely, and he stands shaking on the landing. This boy who has travelled through storm and darkness to reach this doorway, who has placed all his hope in the possibility of help from a man whose reputation has reached even his distant corner of Britain. Watson looks at Mrs. Hudson, then at the boy, then back toward the sitting room, where, behind a closed door, Sherlock Holmes sleeps the sleep of deep exhaustion. Every instinct of friendship and care says to send the boy away, to tell him to return tomorrow when Holmes has properly rested, when the crisis of his friend's depletion has been adequately addressed. But Watson's other instincts, the ones trained by years of medicine and emergency, read the genuine terror in the boy's eyes, the authentic desperation, and recognize that whatever this is, it cannot wait for convenience or proper rest. He makes his decision quickly, as he has learned to do in moments of crisis. "Come in," he tells the boy. "Dry yourself by the fire. I'll wake Mr. Holmes." The boy's face transforms with relief, so profound it is almost painful to witness. The desperate hope of someone who has been drowning and suddenly glimpses rescue. He stumbles into the sitting room, barely noticing his surroundings. And Mrs. Hudson gives Watson a look that contains both understanding and reproach. She knows as well as he does that Holmes needs rest, but she knows equally well that neither of them could turn away genuine need, no matter how poorly timed. Watson moves to Holmes's bedroom door and knocks softly. "Holmes." "I'm sorry, but you're needed." Silence, then the rustling of movement, then the door opens to reveal Holmes, his hair disarranged from sleep, his eyes still somewhat unfocused, but already his expression is shifting from confusion to alertness, because these words, "you're needed," have always been the call that supersedes all other considerations, all personal needs or wants, the summons that defines his purpose in the world. What is it? His voice is rough from sleep, but clearing rapidly, consciousness reasserting itself with remarkable speed. A young man, clearly terrified, speaks of his sister missing from a locked room, of village superstitions, about goddesses and sacrifice. He's travelled all day to reach us. Watson keeps his voice low, aware of the boy waiting in the next room, of Mrs. Hudson hovering with concern. "I would not have woken you if I did not believe the matter was genuinely urgent." Holmes's eyes have fully sharpened now, the fog of sleep burned away by the spark of new mystery, new puzzle, the kind of problem that his mind cannot resist, even when his body protests. "Give me 2 minutes," he says, already turning back into his room, already transitioning from sleep to work with the speed that has always characterized him, the ability to shift states that Watson has long since ceased to find remarkable, and simply accepts as part of who his friend is. Watson returns to the sitting room, where Mrs. Hudson has already settled the boy near the fire, and pressed a cup of hot tea into his shaking hands. The young man sits on the edge of a chair, barely conscious of the water pooling beneath him, his entire attention focused on the bedroom door, waiting with the desperate intensity of someone whose entire world depends on what happens next. Holmes emerges less than 2 minutes later, dressed in ordinary clothes, but wearing them with the sharpness of full consciousness, his hair brushed back, his face alert and focused, every trace of sleepiness erased as though it had never existed. He moves into the sitting room with purpose, his eyes already cataloguing details. The boy's clothing, his manner, the mud on his boots, the particular way his hands shake as he holds the teacup. "I am Sherlock Holmes," he says, his voice carrying the particular tone of focused attention that Watson knows means his friend is already working, already gathering data, already beginning the process of constructing understanding from observation. "Tell me everything, beginning with your name and where you've come from." The boy sets down his tea with hands that rattle the cup against the saucer, but his voice steadies as he begins to speak, because Holmes's presence has that effect. It suggests that chaos can be ordered, that mystery can be penetrated, that there is always an answer if one knows how to look. "My name is Gareth Pemberton," he begins, and his accent marks him as Welsh. Though educated, the vowels shaped by both native language and English schooling. "I've come from Llanmadog, a village in Gower, on the coast of South Wales. My sister, Bronwyn, disappeared 2 nights ago from her bedroom. The door was locked from the inside, the windows secured, and when morning came and she did not appear for breakfast, we broke down the door and found the room empty. No sign of struggle, no indication of how she departed, simply gone, as though she had vanished into air. Holmes has settled into his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in his characteristic posture of intense focus. And Watson knows that behind those sharp eyes, machinery is already turning, processing information, filing away details, constructing frameworks of possibility. "Continue," Holmes says. "Tell me about the village's reaction, this mention of the Morrigan." Gareth swallows hard, his hands clenching in his lap. "Our village is old, Mr. Holmes. Very old. There are ruins nearby that predate the Romans, standing stones and burial mounds that locals still leave offerings at, despite what the vicar says. Most dismiss it as harmless tradition, but there are some, particularly the elderly, who maintain that the old gods never left, that they merely sleep, and that certain actions can wake them, anger them. And your father committed such an action." Holmes's tone is neutral, non-judgmental, simply seeking information. 3 months ago, my father, he's a surveyor, you see, works for the railway company. He was engaged to map a proposed route for a new spur line that would connect our village to the main network. The route he proposed required excavation through one of the old burial mounds, what the locals call Morwen's Barrow. There was tremendous opposition, threats even, but my father insisted that it was mere superstition, that progress could not be halted by fear of imaginary curses. He's a modern man, Mr. Holmes, believes in reason and science and practical matters. But the excavation proceeded, Watson asks, drawn into the narrative despite himself. "It began last month," Gareth confirms, his voice dropping. "And from the first day, there were problems. Equipment failures, injuries, minor ones, but frequent, strange sounds heard at night near the excavation site. The workers became increasingly fearful, and then, 2 weeks ago, the foreman's son fell ill with a wasting sickness that the doctors cannot explain. He grows weaker by the day, speaks in his fever of a woman in black who sits at the foot of his bed and watches him with eyes like winter storms." Holmes's expression has not changed, but Watson can read the minute signs of increased interest. A slight forward lean, a quickening of breath, the particular quality of stillness that indicates complete attention. "And now your sister has disappeared, and the village connects this to the violation of the barrow. They say the Morrigan has taken her," Gareth whispers, and now tears do fall, running down his young face unchecked. "They say that my father's transgression against the sacred ground has brought her wrath, and that Bronwyn has been taken as the first of 3 sacrifices that the goddess will demand, one for each aspect of her threefold nature: maiden, mother, crone. They say that on the night of the new moon, which is 5 days hence, she will complete the sacrificial rites, and Bronwyn will be lost forever, transformed into one of the goddess's servants, neither living nor dead, bound to walk the barrow mounds for eternity. He looks up at Holmes with eyes that contain both hope and despair, the look of someone who has placed his last bet on a single number and knows the odds are against him. My father says it is nonsense, that someone has taken Bronwyn for reasons that have nothing to do with ancient goddesses, perhaps to frighten him into halting the excavation, perhaps for ransom, though no demand has been made. He says that belief in such things is weakness, that giving credence to superstition only strengthens it. But Mr. Holmes, I have lived in that village all my life, and I have seen things, heard things, that I cannot explain through reason alone. I do not know if I believe in the Morrigan, but I believe that something is happening, something beyond my understanding, and I believe that if anyone can unravel it, find the truth beneath the mystery, save my sister, it is you. The speech exhausted, Gareth falls silent, his entire body slumped with the weight of fear and exhaustion, and the desperate hope that he has found help. The rain continues its endless percussion against the windows, and the fire crackles softly, and for a long moment the only sound is breathing and rain and the settling of coal in the grate. Holmes remains motionless for several heartbeats, his eyes slightly unfocused in the way that Watson recognizes as intense internal calculation, weighing factors and possibilities, constructing scenarios and testing them against available data. Then he rises in a single fluid movement, decision made, commitment given. "We leave tonight," he announces, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Mrs. Hudson, if you would be so kind as to pack provisions for a journey of several days' duration. Watson, gather your medical bag and whatever items you'll require. This promises to involve rural conditions and potentially difficult terrain. Mr. Pemberton, when is the next train to South Wales?" Gareth has risen as well, his face transformed with relief and gratitude. "There's a night train departing Paddington at 11 o'clock, sir. It reaches Swansea shortly after dawn, and from there we can hire a carriage to Lanmadoc, perhaps 4 hours' journey." "Excellent. That gives us—" Holmes glances at the clock on the mantel. "Approximately 90 minutes to prepare. Mrs. Hudson, I apologize for the disruption to your evening. Watson, I apologize for the disruption to my rest, but you were quite correct to wake me." Some matters cannot wait for convenience. Watson meets his friend's eyes and sees there not just the excitement of new mystery, but also gratitude for the decision made on his behalf, acknowledgement that the interruption of rest was the right choice, the only choice, because this is who they are, who they have chosen to be, the ones who answer when called, regardless of personal cost or convenience. "I'll gather our things," Watson says simply, already moving toward his room, already mentally cataloguing what will be needed for a journey into rural Wales in autumn, for an investigation that involves locked rooms and disappearances and ancient goddesses. Medical supplies, certainly. Warm clothing, perhaps his service revolver, though he does not mention this aloud, simply makes a mental note to ensure it is cleaned and loaded and packed where it can be easily accessed should need arise. Behind him, he hears Holmes beginning to question Gareth more closely. Details about the sister's personality and habits, about the layout of the house and the locked room, about the village's composition and notable residents, about the excavation site and the nature of the burial mound. The questions come rapid fire, each answer spawning 3 new questions. And Watson recognizes this as Holmes's method of simultaneously gathering information and organizing his thoughts, of constructing the framework upon which investigation can be hung. In his room, Watson moves with the efficiency of long practice, selecting clothing appropriate for country work, packing his medical bag with supplies he hopes will not be needed, but experience suggests probably will be, adding small comforts: a flask of brandy, a packet of tobacco, matches, a small notebook and pencil, the kinds of items that make difficult situations slightly more manageable. He includes his pistol with a slight sense of sheepishness, because surely this matter will prove to have a rational explanation. Surely there is no actual danger beyond the normal risks of investigation. But Watson has learned through hard experience that surely is a word that often precedes unpleasant surprises, and he will not leave his friend unprotected through optimism that proves unfounded. He changes into his travelling clothes, warm wool and sturdy boots, and returns to the sitting room to find Holmes already dressed for travel, a small valise beside his chair, still in conversation with Gareth, who has regained some colour now that hope has been restored, now that action is imminent. Mrs. Hudson enters with a basket covered with a cloth, provisions for the journey, and Watson sees the concern in her eyes, the motherly worry for these two men who so often rush toward danger with inadequate regard for their own safety. "You'll be careful," she says, and it is not quite a question, more a command phrased as inquiry. "Always, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes assures her with a smile that is genuine but makes no actual promises, because being careful and being effective are not always compatible, and both Holmes and Mrs. Hudson know this, have had this conversation in various forms over years of similar departures. "The house will be here when you return," she says firmly, because this is her gift to them, the maintenance of this space, this refuge, no matter how often or how suddenly they must leave it. However long you're gone, however strange the business, 221B will be waiting. Holmes rises and, in an uncharacteristic gesture that moves Watson more than he would admit, takes Mrs. Hudson's hand briefly, a gesture of gratitude and affection from a man not given to demonstrative emotion. "Thank you," he says quietly. "For everything, always." Then the moment passes, and they are gathering their things, checking that nothing essential has been forgotten, preparing for the journey into rain and darkness, and whatever mysteries await in a distant Welsh village, where ancient stones keep their secrets, and a young woman has vanished from a locked room. Watson helps Gareth with his still damp coat. Holmes ensures the fire is safely banked, and then they are descending the familiar stairs, passing through the door into the rain-swept street where a cab waits, summoned by Mrs. Hudson's practical foresight. "Paddington Station," Holmes instructs the driver, and they climb into the cab's dark interior, the three of them pressed together on seats designed for two, their valises at their feet, the basket of provisions wedged between them. The cab lurches into motion, and Watson catches one last glimpse of 221B through the rain-streaked window, the familiar outline of the building, the warm glow of gaslight in the windows, Mrs. Hudson's shadow passing across the sitting room as she tidies the evidence of their sudden departure. Then they turn the corner, and it is gone, and they are moving through London's nighttime streets, past public houses spilling light and noise onto wet pavements, past shops shuttered against the weather, past hansoms and carriages, and the occasional pedestrian hunched against the rain. The city passes like a fever dream, familiar yet strange in the darkness and precipitation. And Watson feels that particular sensation that always accompanies the beginning of a case. Anticipation mixed with apprehension, curiosity blended with concern, the sense of standing at the threshold of something unknown, preparing to step across into whatever waits on the other side. Gareth sits tensed between them, his hands clenched in his lap, staring out at the passing city without really seeing it, his entire being focused forward, toward the journey, toward home, toward his missing sister, and the terrible possibilities of what might have become of her. Holmes, by contrast, has settled into that state of alert repose that Watson knows well. His body still, but his mind racing, processing all that has been learned, formulating theories and approaches, preparing for the work ahead. "Tell me about your sister," Holmes says suddenly, his voice cutting through the sound of rain and wheels on cobblestone. Not the facts you've already shared, but who she is. Her personality, her interests, her habits. Paint me a picture of Bronwyn Pemberton, such that I might recognize her if I met her on the street. Gareth turns from the window, startled by the question, and Watson can see him struggling to comply, to translate intimate knowledge into words that might convey meaning to strangers. She was. He stops, corrects himself, because verb tense matters, because hope requires present tense. She is kind, genuinely kind, not merely polite, but actually concerned for others' welfare. She volunteers at the village school, teaching the younger children their letters, and she has a gift for it, for making learning seem like play rather than work. She loves stories, myths especially, the old Welsh tales of Rhiannon and Blodeuwedd and the Mabinogion. Our grandmother, before she died, used to tell these stories in Welsh, and Bronwyn absorbed them all, can recite them almost word for word. His voice has gained strength as he speaks, memory providing anchor against fear. She is curious, always asking questions, wanting to understand how things work, why people believe what they believe. My father says she has a scientific mind, that she should have been born a boy because she would have made an excellent engineer or surveyor. She does not believe in the old superstitions, or at least she did not, but she is fascinated by them, by why they persist, what psychological or social function they serve. So, she would not have been frightened by talk of the Morrigan. Holmes asks, his tone suggesting genuine inquiry rather than challenge. No, she would have been interested, would have wanted to research the mythology, understand the cultural context. In fact, Gareth pauses, something occurring to him. In fact, in the weeks before she disappeared, she had been spending time at the village's small library, such as it is, reading everything she could find about the burial mounds, about the excavation, about local legends associated with Morwen's Barrow. She said she was writing a paper, an essay about the intersection of archaeology and folklore, how physical excavation of ancient sites affects living belief systems in modern communities. Holmes and Watson exchange a glance, both recognizing the significance of this information. A young woman researching ancient sites and local legends, the daughter of the man whose work has violated sacred ground, disappearing from a locked room just as village superstition reaches fever pitch. The connections are too obvious to ignore, though what they mean remains unclear. Did she share any of her findings with you? Holmes asks. Did she mention anything unusual in her research? any specific aspect of the legends or the excavation that particularly interested her. Gareth shakes his head slowly, frustration evident. Not specifically. She would mention occasionally that she'd found an interesting reference, or that she'd spoken with one of the village elders about their memories of the barrow before excavation began. But she did not go into detail. She said she wanted to wait until her essay was complete before sharing it. Wanted to present her ideas fully formed rather than in fragments. I wish now that I had pressed her, asked more questions, but she has always been somewhat private about her intellectual work, preferring to develop ideas internally before exposing them to potential criticism. The cab rattles on through the rain, and Watson watches the city pass, his mind working through implications and possibilities. A bright young woman, curious and analytical, researching the very legends that the village claims have manifested in supernatural abduction. There are connections here, threads that might, when pulled, unravel the mystery. But seeing the threads is not the same as understanding the pattern they form. They reach Paddington Station with 20 minutes to spare before the train's departure, and the transition from cab to platform occurs in a flurry of activity. Securing tickets, finding the correct platform, navigating through the crowds of late-night travellers, porters, vendors selling newspapers and meat pies and tea. The station is vast and echoing, its iron and glass roof creating a space that feels neither fully interior nor fully exterior, where sound bounces strangely and the smoke from engines mingles with London fog to create an atmosphere thick and grey and smelling of coal and steam and human passage. They board the train and find an empty compartment, settling into the worn velvet seats with their luggage stowed overhead and the basket of provisions at their feet. Other passengers pass in the corridor, their faces tired and closed, focused on their own journeys, their own concerns. A whistle blows, shrill and commanding, and the train lurches into motion with a great exhalation of steam, beginning the long journey west toward Wales, toward coastline and ancient stones, and a locked room from which a young woman has vanished. As the train picks up speed, leaving the lights of London behind and plunging into the darkness of the countryside, Watson feels the familiar settling that comes with committed action, the release of decision-making tension, now that the course is set and the journey begun. Beside him, Holmes has already pulled out a small notebook and is writing rapidly, covering pages with his cramped, precise handwriting, recording everything Gareth has told them, organizing information, noting questions that require answers, constructing the framework of investigation. Gareth sits across from them, his face illuminated periodically by lights from stations they pass through, his expression cycling between hope and worry, between the relief of having found help and the terror of what might await at journey's end. Watson catches his eye and offers a small, reassuring smile, though he knows it offers little actual comfort. How can words or smiles reassure when a beloved sister is missing, when time runs out with every passing hour, when the boundary between rational explanation and supernatural impossibility seems increasingly uncertain? The train rushes through the night, its rhythm hypnotic, the sound of wheels on rails creating a steady pulse that underlies all other sounds, the occasional conversation from other compartments, the conductor's passage checking tickets, the screech of brakes as they slow for stations, the renewed surge of acceleration as they resume speed. Rain streams across the windows, turning the darkness outside into moving patterns of water and occasional light. And Watson finds himself mesmerized by these patterns, by the way they shift and reform, never quite the same, but never quite entirely different. And so they travel through the darkness, 3 men bound together by circumstance and need, rushing toward a mystery that involves locked rooms and ancient legends, scientific excavation and supernatural vengeance, the collision of modern rationality with beliefs that predate writing itself. Outside the window, the English countryside passes invisible in the darkness, fields and forests and sleeping villages, all the ordinary geography of a nation that pretends to be entirely modern, entirely rational, but which still harbours, in its forgotten corners and ancient places, mysteries that do not yield to easy explanation. Watson allows his eyes to drift closed, not quite sleeping, but resting, conserving energy for whatever the coming days will demand. He is aware of the train's motion, of the warmth from the compartment's small heater, of Holmes's presence beside him, and Gareth's across from them, and he lets himself simply be carried forward, trusting in the machinery of rail and steam and human engineering to deliver them to whatever awaits. Time passes in the peculiar way it does during night travel, seeming simultaneously endless and remarkably brief, hours compressing into what feels like minutes, or expanding into what feels like days, depending on how one marks their passage. Watson drifts in and out of light sleep, occasionally rousing when the train stops at stations, when conductors call out names of places he does not recognize, when the door to their compartment opens briefly as someone checks tickets or passes through to another car. At some point, Holmes opens his eyes and reaches for the basket of provisions, distributing sandwiches and tea still warm from its flask, and they eat in companionable silence, the simple act of consuming food grounding them in physical need, in the body's requirements that persist regardless of mystery or urgency. Gareth eats mechanically, barely tasting what he consumes, but Holmes and Watson are more mindful, knowing from experience that sustenance must be taken when available, that investigations often involve irregular meals and uncomfortable conditions, that one must build reserves of energy for challenges yet to come. "Tell me about the locked room," Holmes says eventually, sandwich finished, tea cradled in his long-fingered hands. "Spare no detail, however insignificant it might seem. Describe the room's layout, its furnishings, the condition in which you found it when the door was finally broken down." Gareth sets down his half-eaten sandwich, marshalling his thoughts. "The room is on the 2nd floor of our house, at the rear, overlooking the garden, and beyond it, the fields that stretch toward the coast. It is not large, perhaps 12 feet by 15, with a single window facing east, toward the sunrise. The window is the old-fashioned kind, 2 sashes that slide vertically, and it was locked from the inside when we checked it, the catch firmly engaged. The walls are stone. The house is very old, parts of it dating to the 17th century, covered with plaster and whitewashed, with no panelling or wainscoting that might conceal passages or doors." He pauses, visualizing the scene, and Watson can see him struggling with memory, trying to be precise, to notice and report what his eyes had seen, even though his mind had been overwhelmed with shock and fear. The door opens inward, into the room, and it was locked from the inside as well. A simple key lock, the key still in the lock on the interior side when we broke through. The door itself is solid oak, thick with iron fittings, not something one could easily break or force without leaving obvious evidence. And there was no such evidence, Holmes asks. No scratches on the lock, no damage to the doorframe suggesting forced entry. Describe the room's condition, Holmes prompts gently. Begin with the bed and work outward. Tell me everything you remember seeing. Gareth's hands clench in his lap, but his voice remains steady, a testament to his will to help, to contribute whatever he can to the investigation. The bed was made neatly, as though she had made it that morning, or as though she had never slept in it the night before. The covers were smooth, the pillows arranged properly. On the bedside table was a lamp, extinguished, and a book, one of the folklore collections she had been reading from the library. The book was closed, a ribbon marking her place, perhaps a third of the way through. "Do you remember the title?" Holmes asks, and Watson recognizes the sharpness in his friend's tone, the sense that this detail matters, that it might prove significant. "Legends and Lore of the Gower Peninsula," Gareth recalls after a moment's thought. "Published locally, perhaps 20 years ago, by a man named Cadwallader, I think, or possibly Cadogan." She had mentioned it as being one of the more comprehensive collections of the region's traditions and superstitions. Holmes makes a note, and Gareth continues. Her wardrobe stood against one wall, its doors closed, and when we opened it, all her clothing appeared to be present. We found no indication that she had packed for travel or taken particular items with her. Her writing desk was beneath the window, and on it were papers. Clearly the essay she had been working on. Pages of notes in her careful handwriting. Drawings she had made of the burial mound and the standing stones. Copies she had made of various symbols she had found in her research. Were these papers disturbed, disordered in any way? Holmes's intensity has increased, his body leaning forward slightly, every aspect of his attention focused on Gareth's words. No, they were quite neat, stacked and arranged as though she had finished working for the evening and organized everything before retiring. There was an inkwell, capped, and several pens laid out parallel, and a blotter that showed the mirror image of some of her writing, though I did not examine it closely enough to read what it said. And elsewhere in the room, any other objects, any indication of what she might have been doing that evening, any suggestion of disturbance or struggle or anything out of the ordinary. Gareth shakes his head slowly. Nothing. The room looked exactly as it always looked, tidy and organized, everything in its place. If anything, that was what was most disturbing, that there was no disruption, no evidence of anything having occurred. She had simply vanished, as though she had never been there at all, or as though she had stepped out of reality itself, and left only an empty room behind. The train rushes on through the darkness, and silence settles over the compartment as Holmes processes this information, fitting it into whatever frameworks he is constructing in that remarkable mind. Watson watches his friend, seeing the subtle signs of intense mental activity, the slight furrow between his brows, the unconscious movement of his fingers, as though conducting some invisible orchestra of thought. The papers on her desk, Holmes says finally, they remain where she left them. As far as I know, my father instructed that nothing in the room be disturbed, that everything be left exactly as it was in case it provided clues to her whereabouts. Your father is wise, Holmes observes. When we arrive, I will need to examine that room most carefully, along with her papers, her research, everything she was working on. Often, the answer to a disappearance lies in what the missing person was engaged with immediately before they vanished, in what occupied their thoughts and attention. You believe her research is connected to her disappearance? Gareth asks, hope and fear mingled in his voice. This seems to comfort Gareth somewhat. The suggestion of rational connection, of cause and effect that can be traced and understood, rather than supernatural intervention that defies all reason and offers no possibility of prediction or prevention. He settles back in his seat, some of the tension leaving his frame, though worry remains etched in the lines around his eyes, in the set of his jaw. The train begins to slow, and the conductor's voice echoes through the corridor, announcing Swansea, their destination, though dawn has not yet fully broken, and the light seeping through the windows is still more grey than gold. The uncertain illumination of a rainy morning that suggests the sun has risen somewhere beyond the clouds, but has not yet penetrated their thick barrier. They gather their belongings, preparing for the next stage of the journey, and as they disembark onto the platform, Watson feels the change in the air, the salt tang of the sea, the particular quality of coastal atmosphere, the sense of being in a place where land and water negotiate their eternal boundary. Swansea Station is smaller than Paddington, but no less busy in its way, filled with travellers and workers beginning their day, with vendors selling tea and pastries, with the complex choreography of arrival and departure. Gareth leads them through the crowds with the confidence of familiarity, explaining that he must hire a carriage and driver willing to make the journey to Lanmadoc, which will take several hours along roads that are not in the best condition, particularly after so much rain. The negotiation with drivers occurs in Welsh, a language Watson does not speak, but which sounds to his ear like music, like water flowing over stones, all liquid consonants and vowels that seem to carry emotion more directly than English's harder sounds. Eventually, terms are agreed, a price settled, and they load their luggage into a 2-horse carriage driven by a taciturn man who nods at their destination but offers no comment, no reaction to the name Lanmadoc, or any indication that he knows of the strange events occurring there. They climb into the carriage, settling into seats that are less comfortable than the trains, and begin the next leg of the journey, leaving Swansea behind and venturing into the countryside proper, along roads that are indeed rough, deeply rutted and muddy from rain, passing through a landscape that shifts gradually from urban to rural, from buildings pressed close together to increasing spaces between habitations, to farms and fields and stretches of genuine wilderness where civilization has left only the lightest touch. The rain has diminished to a fine mist, not quite falling so much as suspended in the air, and through this mist, Watson can see the landscape emerging, green fields rising toward distant hills, stone walls marking property boundaries, sheep grazing in sodden pastures, the occasional farmhouse with smoke rising from its chimney. It is beautiful in a stark, elemental way, this landscape that has been farmed and inhabited for thousands of years, yet still manages to feel wild, untamed, barely tolerant of human presence. They pass through small villages, clusters of stone houses huddled together as though for warmth or protection, and at each one Watson notices the same pattern. People stopping in their activities to watch the carriage pass, faces turning toward them with expressions difficult to read at this distance, something between curiosity and concern, between interest and wariness. It is as though news of their passage precedes them, as though the countryside itself is aware that strangers travel toward Lanmadog, toward the place where the burial mound has been violated, and a young woman has vanished. "We're getting close," Gareth says eventually, his voice tight with tension that has been building as they approach his home, as the abstract journey transforms into arrival at the place where crisis is real and immediate. Another mile, perhaps 2, and we'll reach Lanmadog. The house stands at the village's edge, near the path that leads to the excavation site. Holmes, who has been gazing out the window with apparent casualness, sits up straighter, his attention sharpening. "I see standing stones," he observes, pointing toward what Watson had taken to be natural rock formations, but which, on closer examination, proved to be weathered megaliths, deliberately placed in some pattern whose logic is lost to time. "The brides," Gareth confirms. "Local legend says they are women who danced on the Sabbath and were turned to stone as punishment. But scholars believe they are actually the remains of a stone circle, perhaps 4,000 years old, contemporary with Stonehenge, though much smaller and less preserved. The burial mound, Morwen's Barrow, lies just beyond them, about half a mile from where we are now. The carriage tops arise, and suddenly the sea is visible in the distance, a grey line between the green of land and the grey of sky, barely distinguishable except as a quality of openness, of boundary reached. The light has strengthened somewhat, though the overcast remains complete, and in this diffuse illumination, Watson can make out more detail of the landscape, the way the fields slope toward the coast, the dark shadows that suggest forests or thick woodland, and there, marked clearly even from this distance, a raw wound in the earth where excavation has begun, where modern machinery has torn into ancient soil. Morwen's Barrow, Gareth says unnecessarily, because what else could that disturbed earth signify? That violation of the landscape's smooth contours. Even from here, Watson can see the excavation's extent. The cut made into the mound's side, the heaps of removed soil, the wooden structures that must be part of the survey work, the tracks where wagons have hauled material away. It looks brutal, this intrusion of industry into the gentle curves of ancient landscape, like a wound that has not healed but remains raw and painful. The carriage descends toward the village, which reveals itself gradually. First, the church steeple, then rooftops, then the buildings themselves, perhaps 40 or 50 structures, arranged along a single main street, with lanes branching off toward farms and fields. Smoke rises from chimneys, and Watson can see people moving about their morning activities, though as the carriage enters the village proper, he notices the same reaction they encountered in earlier villages. People stopping, watching, faces turning toward them, with expressions of concern, or perhaps hostility, though nothing overt, nothing actionable, merely a quality of attention that suggests their arrival is noted, evaluated, perhaps not entirely welcomed. The carriage stops before a substantial stone house, standing somewhat apart from the village centre, its windows reflecting the grey sky. Smoke rising from its chimney, indicating habitation and warmth within. Gareth climbs down quickly, his relief at arrival evident, and Holmes and Watson follow more slowly, gathering their luggage, paying the driver, who accepts his fee with a nod, and immediately turns his horses back toward the direction they've come. Apparently, having no desire to linger in Lanmadoc longer than absolutely necessary. The front door opens before they can knock, and a man emerges, whom Watson immediately recognizes as Gareth's father. The same basic features, though aged and sharpened by responsibility and current crisis. The same set to the jaw, the same colour of hair, though greying at the temples. He is dressed for work, in practical clothes that speak of outdoor activity. But he has clearly been waiting for their arrival, watching for the carriage, because he shows no surprise at finding them at his threshold. "Mr. Holmes," he says, his voice carrying the same Welsh accent as his son, but more controlled, more anglicised by years of working with English business interests. "I am Meredith Pemberton. Gareth telegrammed that he had sought your assistance, though I confess I am uncertain whether to be grateful or concerned that my son's fears have led him to engage a detective for what is undoubtedly a matter that will resolve itself through ordinary means." There is tension in this greeting, skepticism mixed with barely concealed desperation, the attitude of a man who insists on rational explanation while simultaneously grappling with events that defy his understanding. Holmes takes his hand and shakes it firmly, his expression neutral, neither offended by the ambivalent welcome nor particularly concerned by it. "Mr. Pemberton, I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. John Watson. Your son has engaged my services, and I am here at his request, not to judge, or to impose my presence where it is not wanted, but to investigate the circumstances of your daughter's disappearance with whatever skills I possess. If you would prefer that I not proceed, you need only say so, and Dr. Watson and I will return to London on the next available train. But if you will permit it, I would like to examine your daughter's room, speak with anyone who might have relevant information, and do what I can to determine what has become of Bronwyn." The directness of this seems to break through Meredith's defences, and something in his face crumbles slightly, the facade of controlled rationality giving way to reveal the frightened father beneath. "Please," he says, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. "Please, if you can help, if there is anything you can do, I do not understand what has happened. I cannot explain it, and every rational solution I have proposed fails to account for the facts. The room was locked, Mr. Holmes, locked from the inside. The window was secured. There is no way she could have left that room, and yet she is not there. She is not anywhere. And the village..." He glances toward the street, where Watson can see people trying not to appear as though they're watching the house while clearly watching the house. The village speaks of nothing but curses and goddesses and ancient vengeance, and I fear that such talk will make something terrible occur. Not because it must, but because belief shapes action, because if enough people convince themselves that supernatural forces are at work, they will act in ways that create the very disasters they claim to fear. "Then let us begin," Holmes says quietly. "Show me her room, show me everything, and trust that whatever has occurred, there is an explanation, a chain of cause and effect that can be traced and understood. The world runs on laws, Mr. Pemberton, on patterns and principles. And while those patterns are sometimes obscured, sometimes hidden beneath layers of confusion and misdirection, they never cease to operate. Your daughter has not been spirited away by ancient goddesses. She has gone somewhere, or been taken somewhere, and the evidence of that movement exists if we know how to read it. This seems to strengthen Meredith, to provide anchor for for his rational inclinations, and he nods firmly before gesturing them into the house. They cross the threshold into a home that speaks of comfortable middle-class existence. Not wealthy, but not struggling, furnished with solid pieces that prioritize function over fashion, walls holding family portraits, and a few landscape paintings, the air smelling of coal fire and cooking, and the accumulated scent of habitation. A woman emerges from what must be the kitchen, her face pale and drawn with worry, and Meredith introduces her as his wife, Caris, Bronwyn's mother. She clasps Watson's hand briefly, her grip surprisingly strong, her eyes searching his face as though seeking reassurance that he cannot honestly provide. "You'll find her?" she asks, and the question is less inquiry than plea, less seeking information than begging for hope. "We will do everything possible," Watson says gently, "because this is the only honest answer, the only promise that can be made without presumption or false comfort." Mr. Holmes is remarkably skilled at unravelling exactly these sorts of mysteries. If she can be found, he will find her. Caris nods, though her eyes fill with tears she does not allow to fall, and she releases his hand, stepping back to allow them the passage. Meredith leads them up a narrow staircase, the steps worn smooth by generations of feet, to the second floor where a hallway runs the length of the house, doors opening off it to various rooms. At the hallway's end, a door stands closed, and Watson notices that it has been recently damaged, the frame showing splintered wood around the lock where it was forced open, the door itself hanging slightly askew where its hinges have been stressed beyond their design. "This is her room," Meredith says, his voice tight. "We have disturbed nothing since we broke through the door, only looked inside long enough to confirm that she was not there, not hiding, not injured. Everything is exactly as it was when we discovered her absence." Holmes nods and approaches the door with the careful attention he brings to all physical evidence, examining the damaged frame without touching it initially, his eyes cataloguing every detail of the splintered wood, the bent nails, the way the lock has been forced. He produces a magnifying glass from his pocket, that familiar tool that Watson has seen him employ hundreds of times, and examines the lock mechanism closely, the scratches on the metal, the position of the key that still remains in the lock on the room's interior side. "The key turns freely?" he asks, and Meredith confirms that it does, that there was no unusual resistance, nothing to suggest the lock had been tampered with from either side. Holmes straightens and finally pushes the door open, stepping across the threshold into Bronwyn Pemberton's room, and Watson follows, his eyes immediately beginning their own catalogue of details, his medical training's habit of observation asserting itself, even though this is not a medical situation, not precisely, though it may well become one depending on what they discover. The room is exactly as Gareth described it, small, tidy, with the bed made neatly and the furnishings arranged with care. The window faces east, as reported, and Holmes moves to it immediately, examining the sashes, the lock, the frame, checking with his magnifying glass for any indication of tampering or forced opening. He tests the sashes, confirming that they are indeed secured from the inside, that the catch is firmly engaged. Watson watches his friend work, seeing the intensity of concentration, the way Holmes seems to absorb information through observation, through touch, through the application of senses so carefully trained that they detect nuances invisible to ordinary perception. He moves to the writing desk beneath the window and spends long minutes examining the papers Gareth mentioned. Pages of neat handwriting, detailed notes about burial practices and local legends, carefully copied symbols that appear to be from ancient inscriptions, or perhaps modern reproductions of ancient marks. Holmes picks up the book Gareth mentioned, Legends and Lore of the Gower Peninsula, and pages through it slowly, pausing at sections where Bronwyn has made marginal notes in pencil, where she has underlined passages or marked pages with scraps of paper. He reads these marked sections with complete attention, occasionally making small sounds that might indicate interest or confirmation or recognition of significance. "Meredith," he says finally, not looking up from the book, "your daughter is investigating connections between the burial mound excavation and local mythological traditions, correct?" "Yes, as I understand it. She saw it as an opportunity to examine how archaeological disruption affects living folklore, how material investigation of ancient sites changes or reinforces traditional beliefs. And in her investigation, did she speak with village elders, with people who maintain the old traditions?" "She spoke with everyone who would speak with her," Karis interjects from the doorway, where she has been hovering, unable to stay away, even though her presence violates her husband's instruction to leave the investigators undisturbed. She interviewed Aniran Evans, who is nearly 90 and knows all the old stories. She spent time with Rhiannon Morgan, who still leaves offerings at the Standing Stones, despite the vicar's disapproval. She even convinced old Dafydd Lloyd to show her the cave system near the coast, the one that local legend says connects to the burial mound, though no one living has ever found such a connection. Holmes's head snaps up at this last detail. Cave system, connected to the burial mound. Tell me more. Karis enters the room fully now, wringing her hands, clearly grateful to be speaking, to be doing something, rather than simply waiting in helpless anxiety. The legend says that Morwen's Barrow is not simply a burial mound, but the entrance to an underground realm, that passages run beneath the earth from the barrow to the sea, emerging in caves along the coast. They say that in ancient times, the priestesses of the goddess would use these passages for rituals, that offerings would be carried through the darkness to be cast into the sea, that the goddess herself dwells in the deepest chambers where no light has ever reached. And your daughter explored these caves? Holmes asks, his intensity increasing. Dafydd showed her the entrance, I believe, but whether she actually explored them, I do not know. She mentioned it only briefly, said something about the caves being dangerous, that portions had collapsed, and that one could easily become lost in the passages that remain open. Holmes and Watson exchange a glance, and Watson can read in his friend's expression the same thought that has occurred to him. A young woman interested in connections between burial mounds and coastal caves, a locked room from which she has vanished, and the possibility of passages beneath the earth connecting the two. If such passages exist, if they connect in ways that legend suggests, then perhaps the locked room mystery is not as impossible as it appears. I need to see the excavation site, Holmes announces, setting down the book carefully, arranging the papers on the desk as he found them. And I need to speak with this Dafydd Lloyd about the cave system. But first, he moves to the bed and kneels beside it, examining the floor, running his hands along the floorboards, testing each one for looseness or hollowness beneath. He checks along the walls, tapping them carefully, listening for any variation in sound that might indicate concealed space. He examines every surface, every object, with such thoroughness that Watson knows this process will take time, that Holmes will not leave until he has satisfied himself that he's observed everything observable. Watson turns to Meredith and Carys, who stand watching with expressions mixing hope and anxiety. "Perhaps you might show me the rest of the house," he suggests gently. "Tell me about the family's routine, about what occurred on the day of Bronwyn's disappearance. Sometimes the context surrounding an event is as important as the event itself." They seize on this gratefully, leading him from the room and along the hallway, beginning to narrate their ordinary lives, their routines and patterns, and Watson listens carefully, noting details not because he expects them to solve the mystery, but because understanding the human context, the emotional landscape, is as important as understanding the physical evidence. These are good people, worried people, trying to comprehend something that defies their understanding, and his role, he understands, is partly investigative, but also partly simply to bear witness, to acknowledge their suffering, to provide the human connection that Holmes's brilliant but sometimes impersonal methodology cannot supply. Behind him, he can hear Holmes continuing his methodical examination, the soft sounds of careful investigation, and Watson trusts that if there is physical evidence to be found, his friend will find it. His own task now is to understand the people, the family, the human dimensions of this crisis, because mysteries are never solved by evidence alone, but require understanding of motive, of psychology, of the complex reasons why people do what they do. And somewhere, hidden by locked rooms or underground passages or cruel human agency, Bronwyn Pemberton waits to be found, waits for rescue or discovery, or whatever ending her story will reveal. The clock is running, 5 days until the new moon, that village legend claims will seal her fate. And every hour that passes narrows the window for successful intervention. Watson feels the weight of this urgency, this ticking clock, but he also knows that investigation cannot be rushed, that methodical thoroughness is their best chance of success, even as time dwindles toward whatever conclusion awaits. The house tour continues, Meredith and Carys speaking in overlapping narratives about their daughter, about her habits and character, about the day of her disappearance, when everything seemed normal until it suddenly wasn't, when ordinary breakfast gave no indication that by evening their world would be shattered by inexplicable absence. And Watson listens, absorbs, files away every detail in memory, building his own understanding of Bronwyn, not as abstract mystery, but as real person, daughter and sister, scholar and curious mind, someone who deserves to be found, to be returned to those who love her, to have her story end with rescue rather than tragedy. The examination of the house complete, Holmes insists on visiting the excavation site immediately, before speaking with any village residents, before conducting interviews that might be coloured by knowledge of what physical evidence reveals. They walk, the four of them, Holmes and Watson, Meredith and Gareth, through the village along a muddy path that leads toward the sea, toward the standing stones called the Brides, toward the raw wound of Morwen's Barrow's excavation. The villagers watch them pass, some openly, some from behind curtains, or from positions that suggest they are engaged in other activities, but which place them perfectly to observe. Watson feels the weight of this scrutiny, the sense of being evaluated, judged, perhaps found wanting, or perhaps simply viewed with the suspicion that isolated communities often direct toward outsiders, particularly outsiders who arrive during times of crisis and upheaval. The path climbs slightly, following the landscape's natural contours, and as they walk, Holmes questions Meredith about the excavation. When it began, how many workers are involved, what has been found so far, what the timeline looks like for completion. Meredith answers with the mixture of pride and defensive worry that characterizes his entire attitude toward this project. Pride in the work, in the technical challenges overcome, in the importance of connecting his village to the wider world through rail service, but worry about the costs, the opposition, the strange events that have plagued the work from its inception. "We have found more than we expected," Meredith admits as they approach the site. The barrow is larger than surface appearance suggested, with multiple chambers arranged around a central passage. There are signs of ritual use extending far later than the Bronze Age construction. Roman-era offerings, medieval inscriptions, even relatively modern items suggesting the site remained sacred and in use long after its original builders vanished. Dr. Cavendish, the archaeologist the railway company brought in to document the excavation, has been beside himself with excitement, calls it one of the most significant finds in Wales in decades. Dr. Cavendish is still on site? Holmes asks, and something in his tone suggests this matters, that this person will be important to question. He maintains a tent near the excavation, sleeps there most nights, documenting everything before the work proceeds. He views the railway's needs and his archaeological imperatives as being in constant tension. We want to excavate quickly and begin construction. He wants to proceed slowly, to record everything, to remove artifacts with painstaking care. It has been difficult at times. They crest a small rise, and the excavation site spreads before them, more extensive than Watson had realized from their earlier distant view. The burial mound has been partially deconstructed, one entire side carved away to reveal interior chambers. Passages lined with massive stones supporting capstones overhead, creating spaces that have existed in darkness for thousands of years until modern work exposed them to light. Wooden scaffolding holds back the earth where excavation has weakened the structure's integrity, and tracks for small carts run into the mound's interior, allowing material to be removed without damaging the archaeological features. But what strikes Watson most forcefully is not the engineering or the ancient stonework, but the sense of violation, the feeling that something peaceful and quiet has been disrobed, that secrets meant to remain hidden have been exposed against their will. It is an irrational response, he tells himself, simple emotional projection onto neutral physical space. But the feeling persists. This place does not welcome their presence, does not want to yield its mysteries to modern investigation. A man emerges from a canvas tent pitched nearby, his appearance immediately marking him as an academic rather than a labourer. Spectacles, untidy hair, clothing more appropriate for a library than an excavation site, but now thoroughly mud-stained and worn. He approaches with visible curiosity, his gaze moving between them as though trying to determine who they are and what brings them to his sight. Dr. Cavendish, Meredith calls in greeting. These gentlemen are Sherlock Holmes and a doctor. Watson, investigators from London, whom my son has engaged regarding Bronwyn's disappearance. They wish to examine the excavation site as part of their investigation. Cavendish's face transforms with recognition at Holmes's name, his expression shifting from wary curiosity to something approaching excitement. Sherlock Holmes, the consulting detective? Good Lord, I never imagined. That is, I have read accounts of your methods, found them fascinating from an analytical perspective. The application of scientific observation and deductive reasoning to criminal investigation represents a sort of archaeology of human behavior, if you will, excavating truth from layers of deception and confusion. Holmes accepts this effusive greeting with a slight smile that Watson recognizes as genuine pleasure. His friend appreciates intelligent conversation from those who understand his methods, even when such conversation comes from unexpected sources. Dr. Cavendish, I am interested in your work here, both from the perspective of understanding the site's significance and from the immediate perspective of determining whether the excavation might have any connection to Miss Pemberton's disappearance. Connection? Cavendish's brow furrows. I cannot imagine what connection there might be, except insofar as her father's role in the project has made their family a focus of village anger and superstitious fear. But physically, actually, I cannot see how a burial mound, however extensive, could relate to a young woman vanishing from a locked room in her home. Nevertheless, I must examine it thoroughly. May I? Holmes gestures toward the excavation, and Cavendish nods eagerly, clearly pleased to have the opportunity to demonstrate his work to someone he perceives as intellectually sympathetic. They approach the exposed interior of the mound, and Watson feels his breath catch slightly at what comes into view. A passage leading into darkness, its walls formed of massive stones fitted together with such precision that no mortar was needed, their surfaces carved with symbols and patterns that might be decorative or might carry meaning lost to time. The passage extends perhaps 20 feet before turning, disappearing into shadow that lantern light only partially dispels. The central passage runs approximately 40 feet into the mound's heart. Cavendish explains, his voice taking on the particular enthusiasm of the specialist discussing his passion. It terminates in a circular chamber, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, with 3 smaller chambers branching off from it. The construction date is Bronze Age, certainly, probably around 2000 BCE, making it contemporary with Stonehenge and other major megalithic sites. But what makes this site particularly remarkable is the evidence of continuous use and modification over millennia. He leads them into the passage, and Watson experiences the particular sensation of entering spaces not designed for human comfort. Spaces that existed long before the concept of comfort had any meaning, that were built for purposes we can only guess at by people whose entire way of understanding the world has vanished, leaving only these mute stone testaments. The air inside is cold and damp, smelling of earth and age, and the sounds from outside fade quickly, replaced by the peculiar acoustic deadness of enclosed space. They navigate the passage's turn, and ahead the darkness deepens, broken only by the lamp Cavendish carries, its light playing across stone walls that show evidence of carving, spirals and lozenges, geometric patterns, and what might be stylized human or animal figures, though so worn by time that interpretation becomes speculation. The chamber, Cavendish announces, and they step into a circular space exactly as he described, with a ceiling supported by a massive central pillar of stone, 3 darker openings indicating the side chambers branching off. The floor here is not earth, but flat stone, clearly laid with intention, and at the chamber's center is a rectangular depression, also stone-lined, purpose unclear, but suggesting something ritual, something ceremonial. Holmes moves through the space methodically, examining walls, floor, ceiling, the openings to side chambers. He produces his magnifying glass again and studies the carved symbols carefully, occasionally making small sounds that might indicate recognition or merely interest. Watson watches him work while also conducting his own observation, noting the way sound behaves in this space, how voices seem both amplified and deadened simultaneously, how the lamplight creates shadows that shift and dance in ways that seem almost animate. "Have you explored all the chambers thoroughly?" Holmes asks Cavendish, without looking up from his examination of a particularly complex spiral carved into the stone. "Yes, though carefully, documenting everything before proceeding deeper. 2 of the side chambers are quite small, perhaps 6 feet deep, probably storage or offering spaces. But the third..." Cavendish's voice carries a note of excitement. "The third extends much farther, becomes a natural cave passage that we have followed for perhaps 100 feet before it becomes too narrow and dangerous to proceed without proper cave exploring equipment, which the railway company sees no reason to provide." Holmes straightens suddenly, his entire body indicating sharp attention. A natural cave passage connecting to the artificial burial chamber? Leading in which direction? Toward the coast, generally northwest, though the passage curves, and it's difficult to determine precise heading without surveying equipment. "Mr. Holmes, surely you cannot think. The passage is narrow, requires crawling in some sections, and becomes increasingly unstable the farther one proceeds. It would be extraordinarily dangerous for anyone unfamiliar with cave systems to attempt exploration, particularly alone. Nevertheless, I must see it." Holmes's tone brooks no argument, and Cavendish, after a moment's hesitation, nods and leads them toward the third side chamber, the one that opens not onto artificial construction, but onto natural geology. The transition is visible at the chamber's entrance, the precisely fitted masonry giving way to rough stone, walls that are no longer flat but irregular, carved by water rather than human hands. Cavendish's lamp illuminates only the first section, showing a passage perhaps 4 feet high, requiring stooping or crawling, extending forward into darkness that seems absolute, that swallows light like thick velvet. "We placed markers as we explored," Cavendish explains, pointing to white paint marks on the walls at intervals. "They indicate the extent of our investigation. Beyond the last marker, we have not gone. The passage becomes increasingly constricted and shows signs of instability, loose rock overhead, areas where water seepage has weakened the stone." Holmes has crouched at the passage entrance, examining the floor carefully, running his fingers along the stone, and Watson recognizes the posture, the intensity of focus. "There are recent marks here," Holmes says quietly. "Scuff marks in the sediment, disturbances that are not consistent with archaeological investigation. Someone has passed through here recently, within days certainly, possibly within hours." "That's impossible," Cavendish protests. "We sealed this passage 3 days ago after our last exploration, placed boards across the entrance specifically to prevent anyone from attempting to enter without proper equipment and supervision. Those boards were in place when I checked yesterday morning. And yet they are not in place now," Holmes observes, gesturing to where boards lie stacked neatly against the chamber wall, removed and set aside with care, rather than broken or forced. "Someone has entered this passage recently, and the disturbances in the sediment suggest they proceeded quite far, beyond where your markers end. Watson feels his pulse quicken with the realization of what Holmes is suggesting, that Bronwyn Pemberton might have entered this passage, might even now be somewhere in the darkness ahead, lost or trapped, or... He does not complete the thought, does not allow himself to imagine worst outcomes when better possibilities remain. "We must follow," Holmes announces, already beginning to remove his jacket, preparing for the confined passage ahead. "Watson, you need not accompany me. The passage is clearly dangerous, and there is no reason for both of us to take the risk." "Don't be ridiculous," Watson replies, already following his friend's example, removing his own jacket and checking that his small electric torch, a recent acquisition that he has been waiting for opportunity to use, is functioning properly. "You are not venturing into unknown cave passages alone. Dr. Cavendish, do you have rope? Additional light sources? If we are to do this, we should do it with at least minimal precautions." Cavendish hurries to gather equipment, while Meredith and Gareth hover with expressions of concern and confusion, clearly torn between hope that this passage might lead to Bronwyn and fear of what might be found. Holmes accepts rope from Cavendish, ties one end around his waist, and hands the other end to Meredith. "Feed this out as we proceed," he instructs. "If we do not return within..." He glances at his watch. "Within 90 minutes. Or, if you feel 3 sharp tugs on the rope, fetch help. Contact the local constabulary. Organize a proper rescue party with cave exploration equipment. But do not, under any circumstances, follow us into the passage yourself. We are professionals accustomed to dangerous situations, and even we are taking substantial risks. Understood?" Meredith nods mutely, accepting the rope with hands that shake slightly, and Watson sees in the man's face the terrible conflict between wanting to search for his daughter himself and recognizing that doing so untrained might only create additional casualties, additional problems requiring resolution. Holmes produces his own electric torch. He and Watson had invested in matching models after a case the previous year that involved midnight investigation of unlit warehouses, and tests it, ensuring bright, steady light. "Follow closely," he tells Watson. "Watch your head. Test each hand and foothold before committing weight. If the passage becomes too narrow or too unstable, we retreat immediately. No argument, no heroics. Agreed?" "Agreed," Watson confirms, though he privately doubts that either of them would retreat if there were any chance of finding Bronwyn Pemberton alive ahead. Any possibility that proceeding might mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. And then Holmes is entering the passage, his torch beam swinging ahead to illuminate rough stone walls, and Watson follows, feeling the weight of earth and stone overhead. The enclosed space pressing in from all sides, the darkness ahead absolute, except where their electric lights push it back temporarily, briefly, creating small moving spheres of visibility in the endless black. The passage forces them to crawl, the ceiling too low for even crouching, the floor rough and wet beneath their hands and knees. The sound of their breathing seems enormously loud in the confined space, echoing slightly, mingling with the steady drip of water from unseen sources, with the scurry of small things in the darkness, rats or beetles or other creatures that make their homes in eternal night. They pass Cavendish's markers, white paint standing out starkly against grey stone, and Watson counts them mentally as they proceed. 1, 2, 3, each marker representing perhaps 20 feet of progress into the Earth's depths, each one taking them farther from safety, from light, from the possibility of easy retreat. "There," Holmes says suddenly, his torch illuminating something ahead, and Watson strains to see what has caught his friend's attention. A scrap of cloth, pale blue, snagged on a rough projection of stone at the passage's edge. Holmes carefully frees it, examines it closely. "Recent," he announces. "The fabric is clean, not yet substantially soiled by contact with the damp stone. And unless I am very much mistaken, this is cotton of reasonable quality, the sort a middle-class young woman might use for a day dress or nightgown." "She came this way," Watson breathes, hope and horror mingling. But why? What would possess her to attempt this passage alone, at night, without proper equipment? "That," Holmes says grimly, "is precisely what we must determine. But first, we must find where she went, whether she turned back or proceeded forward, whether she is still in these passages, or whether they lead somewhere else, somewhere that explains a locked room mystery and a village convinced of supernatural intervention." They continue forward, the passage gradually widening slightly, the ceiling rising enough that they can move in a crouch rather than crawling, though this relief is offset by increasing evidence that the passage is not stable. Loose rocks overhead, places where water seepage has created mud flows, sections where the walls show cracks that might be natural settling or might indicate imminent collapse. Watson's back aches from the hunched position. His hands are raw from contact with rough stone, and he has lost all sense of how far they've travelled, or how long they've been in the darkness. Time behaves strangely in such spaces, stretching and compressing without reference points, without the regular progression of light and shadow that normally marks its passage. He focuses on following Holmes's light, on placing each hand and foot carefully, on breathing steadily, despite the oppressive weight of earth overhead, despite the primal fear that whispers about being trapped, about passages collapsing, about darkness eternal and absolute. And then, ahead, Holmes stops suddenly, his torch beam fixed on something Watson cannot quite make out. "Watson," he says, his voice carrying a strange quality, neither triumph nor defeat, but something between. "I believe we have found something significant." Watson pushes forward, his own torch adding its light to Holmes's. And now he can see what has arrested his friend's attention. The passage has opened into a larger space, not quite a chamber, but a widening where water has created a natural pool. And at the pool's edge, arranged with clear intention, are objects that do not belong in a cave, that speak of human presence and purpose. Candles, melted but not ancient, perhaps days or at most weeks old. A small leather journal, its pages damp but readable, lying open as though someone had been writing, and then set it down intending to return. And most tellingly, most disturbingly, a piece of jewellery, a pendant on a silver chain, catching their torchlight and throwing it back in flashes that seem almost alive in the darkness. Holmes picks up the pendant carefully, examines it closely. Personal ornament, contemporary design, the kind of item a young woman might wear daily. Gareth, when describing his sister, mentioned she was never without a silver pendant their grandmother had given her, a pendant bearing a symbol of Rhiannon from Welsh mythology. He holds it up, and Watson can see the design etched into the silver. A woman on a horse, stylized but clearly deliberate, clearly meaningful. This is Bronwen's pendant, which means Bronwen reached this place, sat by this pool, perhaps wrote in this journal, lit candles for light, or perhaps for other purposes, ritual purposes, purposes that a young woman researching ancient religions and Celtic goddesses might have understood where others would remain ignorant. Holmes sets down the pendant and picks up the journal carefully, mindful of its dampness, opening it with gentle hands to preserve the fragile pages. His torch illuminates handwriting Watson recognizes from the papers they examined in Bronwyn's room. The same careful script, the same clear formation of letters. But here, the writing shows signs of hurry, of urgency, perhaps of fear. Read aloud, Watson requests, because the confined space and awkward positions make it difficult for him to read over Holmes's shoulder as he normally would. Holmes clears his throat and begins to read, his voice strange in the cave's acoustic deadness, the words seeming to emerge and then immediately vanish, swallowed by darkness. October 30th. I have found it at last. The connection between the barrow and the coastal caves. The passage that legend claimed existed, but that father's surveyors insisted was mere superstition. Dr. Cavendish was right that the passage extends from the burial chamber, but he was wrong to seal it, wrong to dismiss it as too dangerous for further exploration. The answers I seek lie deeper in the earth, in places where the ancient priestesses conducted their mysteries, where offerings were made and transformations occurred. I understand now what the village elders tried to explain, what Aneurin and Rhiannon and old Dafydd were attempting to communicate through their stories and warnings. The Morrigan is not a goddess in the Christian sense, not a supernatural being who intervenes in human affairs from outside reality. She is something older, something that predates such distinctions, a pattern perhaps, or a principle, something encoded in these stones and passages and the accumulated belief of generations. When the excavation began, when Father's machinery tore into Morwen's barrow, it did not anger a goddess in the sky, but disturbed something that dwells in the earth itself, something that responds not to prayer or supplication, but to action and consequence. The dreams have been growing stronger, more vivid. Each night I see the black-clad woman standing at my window, and though I tell myself she is merely anxiety manifested, merely stress given form by my unconscious mind, I cannot shake the feeling that she is something else, something that has noticed me because I have been searching for her, researching her, trying to understand her nature. She does not speak in these dreams, but her presence communicates meaning. Come deeper, learn more, understand what you have disturbed, before understanding becomes impossible. Tonight, I will follow the passage to its terminus, wherever that may be. I will leave this journal here at the pool as a record of my intentions and discoveries, in case. But no, I will not entertain dark thoughts. I am a modern woman, rational and educated, and if there are answers to be found in the earth's depths, I will find them and return to share them with the world. Science and reason are stronger than superstition, and understanding banishes fear. If anyone reads this and finds me missing... Holmes stops reading, his voice trailing off, and Watson feels cold settling into his bones, a chill that has nothing to do with the cave's natural temperature and everything to do with those final incomplete words. She went deeper, Watson says unnecessarily, stating the obvious, because sometimes the obvious needs voicing. She came this far, left this record, and then proceeded further into the cave system. And has not returned, Holmes adds grimly. or has returned but not retrieved her journal or pendant, which seems unlikely. No, I think we must assume she is still somewhere ahead, either trapped by cave-in or injury, or... He does not complete the thought, does not voice the darker possibilities that they both know exist, that she encountered someone in these passages, someone who wished her harm, or that the unstable passages claimed her, or that she is indeed lost in the darkness, unable to find her way back, slowly succumbing to injury or exposure or despair. We continue, Watson says firmly, because there is no other acceptable choice, no possibility of retreating now that they know she came this way, that she might be just ahead, waiting for rescue. She must have known would eventually come, must have hoped would arrive before the candles burned out, before the darkness became permanent. Holmes nods and carefully stores the journal in his inner pocket, protecting it from further water damage, and leaves the pendant where they found it, marking this location clearly should they need to return this way. They continue forward, following the passage as it curves and descends, moving deeper into the earth, farther from sunlight and safety, and the world where cause and effect follow predictable patterns. The passage continues its inexorable descent, and Watson becomes aware of a new sound beneath the drip of water and the scuff of their movement. A distant roar, rhythmic and powerful, that he cannot immediately identify. Holmes hears it too, his head tilting as he concentrates on the sound, trying to determine its source and meaning. The sea, Holmes announces finally. We are hearing the sea, which means this passage must eventually emerge near the coastline, probably in one of the cave systems that Bronwyn's research identified. If we can hear it this clearly, we must be approaching the passage's terminus. Hope surges through Watson, because if the passage leads somewhere rather than simply dead-ending, then Bronwyn might have found her way through, might have emerged into some coastal cave, and be there waiting, sheltered from the elements, unable to return through the passage, but safe enough until rescue arrived. It is a fragile hope, built on optimism rather than evidence, but Watson clings to it because the alternative, that they will find only tragedy ahead, is too painful to fully contemplate. The passage widens further, the ceiling rising until they can finally stand upright, and Watson's relief at being able to straighten his back is profound. The sound of the sea grows louder, and now he can distinguish individual waves, the crash and retreat of water meeting land, the eternal rhythm that has shaped coastlines since before humans existed to observe them. Light appears ahead, not torchlight, not artificial, but the grey natural light of day filtering into the passage from somewhere ahead. They extinguish their electric torches to save the batteries and proceed by this dim natural illumination, moving more quickly now that the way is clear, now that they can see the passage's end approaching. They emerge into a large cave chamber, its ceiling open to the sky through a crack or chimney in the rock overhead, light spilling down to illuminate a space perhaps 30 feet across, its floor a mixture of sand and rock, its walls showing the marks of water at various heights, indicating tidal flow. The opening to the sea is visible on the chamber's far side, an irregular arch, perhaps 10 feet high, through which Watson can see the grey ocean, the endless movement of waves, the eternal restless energy of water meeting land. And there, huddled against one wall, wrapped in a blanket that must have been stored in the cave for precisely this purpose, sits a young woman whose features match the description given by her family, whose face shows exhaustion and fear, but also fierce determination, whose eyes widen with relief and recognition as she sees them emerge from the passage. "Mr. Holmes," she says, her voice hoarse from disuse, or possibly from calling for help that did not come. "Dr. Watson, Gareth sent you? Please tell me Gareth sent you, and that I have not been sitting here for 3 days, imagining rescue that will not actually arrive." Holmes approaches carefully, his movements non-threatening, his voice carrying gentleness that Watson rarely hears, but that always emerges in moments of genuine vulnerability. "Miss Pemberton, yes, your brother engaged my services, and yes, rescue has arrived. Are you injured? Can you walk? Dr. Watson is a physician and will examine you to ensure you have suffered no lasting harm." Watson is already moving forward, his medical training asserting itself, his hands automatically checking for obvious injury, even as his voice murmurs reassurances. "Let me look at you. How long have you been here? Have you had water, food, any injuries from the passage or falls?" Bronwyn allows the examination with the passive cooperation of someone too exhausted to resist, too relieved to do anything but accept help. 3 days, she confirms. "I came through the passage the night I disappeared from my room. I wanted to see where it led, wanted to prove that the legends contained truth, that the connection between the barrow and the sea existed. I found it, obviously, but then the tide came in and the cave entrance flooded, and I could not exit that way. And when I tried to return through the passage I had come through, I became disoriented in the darkness after my last candle burned out, and I thought it wiser to remain here, to wait, than to risk becoming lost in the passage system. There are supplies here. Someone, the village elders I suspect, maintains this place as a sort of shrine or way station. Blankets, water in sealed containers, some food that I have been rationing. She is thin, Watson notes, and shows signs of exposure and exhaustion, but nothing life-threatening, nothing that will not heal with rest and proper nutrition. "You'll be fine," he assures her, "though you gave your family the most terrible fright, and you've disrupted the lives of several busy men who might otherwise have been sleeping comfortably in London, rather than crawling through cave passages in Wales." This wins a weak smile from her, and she attempts to stand, wavering slightly, until Watson steadies her. "I'm sorry," she says, though whether she apologizes to Watson or to the world generally is unclear. "I did not intend to cause such trouble. I only wanted to understand, to prove that the old stories contained historical truth, to demonstrate that archaeology and folklore need not be opposed, but can inform each other, can, together, create understanding deeper than either achieves alone." "And you have proven precisely that," Holmes says, his voice carrying something Watson recognizes as respect, even admiration, for this young woman who pursued her intellectual curiosity despite danger, despite the very real risks she clearly understood, but chose to accept. "You have also solved the mystery of the locked room, demonstrated that impossible disappearances often have quite possible explanations, if one knows where to look, and provided me with one of the more interesting cases I have encountered this year. Now, however, the priority is getting you home, letting your family know you are safe, and allowing Dr. Watson to stuff you full of hot tea and regular meals until he is satisfied that you have recovered from your voluntary ordeal." They help her toward the passage, moving slowly to accommodate her weakened state, and Watson notes that the tide is beginning to come in again, water creeping up the cave floor, making the seaward exit increasingly impassable. The timing is fortunate, he observes. Another hour or two, and the cave entrance would have been fully flooded, which would have complicated matters considerably. Fortune, Holmes says dryly, and also the fact that Bronwyn is intelligent enough to have left her journal where it would be found by anyone searching, creating a trail of evidence that led us directly to her location. Whether she consciously intended this, or simply followed sensible practice for cave exploration, is irrelevant. The result was the same, and the result was successful rescue rather than tragic discovery. They enter the passage again, Bronwyn between them, supported by Watson's arm when the way becomes difficult, moving much more slowly than they descended, but with infinitely lighter hearts. Because the mystery is solved, the missing person found, the case concluded successfully. The rope that Holmes had tied around his waist has remained taut throughout, meaning that Meredith has faithfully maintained his position, feeding out slack as they advanced, and now gathering it back in as they retreat, providing both guidance and the assurance that they are not truly alone in the darkness, that connection to the world above persists. The journey back seems simultaneously longer and shorter than the journey in. Longer because they move slowly, accommodating Bronwyn's exhausted state. Shorter because Watson's mind is less occupied with fear and more with the satisfaction of successful conclusion, with the anticipation of Meredith and Garris's relief when their daughter emerges safe from the earth. They navigate the narrow sections with care, Watson ensuring that Bronwyn does not slip or fall, Holmes ahead scouting the way, and finally, after what might be 20 minutes or might be 2 hours, Watson has entirely lost his sense of time's normal progression. They see light ahead that is not torchlight but lamplight, and hear voices calling their names with urgent concern. They emerge from the passage into the burial chamber, where Meredith and Gareth and Dr. Cavendish wait with expressions cycling from worry to confusion to overwhelming relief as Bronwyn steps into view, filthy and exhausted, but alive, safe, found. Bronwyn! Meredith's voice breaks on his daughter's name, and he rushes forward, gathering her into an embrace that speaks of 3 days' accumulated fear suddenly released, of a father's love that had been holding itself together through sheer will, and now could finally express itself. Garris, who had apparently followed them to the excavation, despite being told to remain at the house, pushes past her husband to wrap her arms around her daughter, and for a moment the three stand locked together, a family reunited, a crisis resolved. Watson meets Holmes's eyes and sees there the satisfaction that his friend always shows at cases successfully concluded, tempered by exhaustion and the lingering effects of crawling through cave passages, and the general depletion. That 3 weeks as Thomas Morton, followed by immediate plunge into new investigation, has created. You should sleep, Watson tells him quietly. Properly sleep for at least 12 hours in a proper bed. Soon, Holmes agrees, but first I must ensure that Miss Pemberton's explanation is officially recorded, that the village understands there was no supernatural intervention, only an intelligent young woman pursuing research that led her through dangerous but entirely natural passages. If we leave mystery unexplained, superstition will fill the vacuum, and the Pemberton family has dealt with enough difficulty without adding ongoing accusations of having angered ancient goddesses. Gareth approaches them, his young face transformed with relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he says simply, inadequately, because what words could possibly express the magnitude of what he feels? The debt he perceives himself to owe these men who travelled through the night and crawled through darkness to find his sister. "Thank you both, more than I can ever properly express." "You are welcome," Watson replies warmly, "though I should warn you that your sister possesses a dangerous combination of intellectual curiosity and physical courage that will likely lead her into further adventures, possibly further situations requiring rescue. You might want to encourage her toward less physically hazardous forms of research." This wins a laugh from Gareth, slightly hysterical with relief, and Bronwyn herself looks up from her parents' embrace to fix them with a gaze that is tired but unrepentant. "I would do the same again," she announces. "I found what I sought, proof that the legends contain geographical truth, that the connection between Barrow and sea exists, that our ancestors encoded real knowledge in their myths and stories. Yes, I badly misjudged the danger. Yes, I should have told someone where I was going. Yes, I understand that I caused terrible worry and disruption. But I do not regret the investigation itself, only its poor execution." Bronwyn's face shows surprise, followed by consideration, and Watson can almost see her mind beginning to work on this suggestion. To imagine how her experience might be transformed from personal crisis into intellectual contribution. "I would need to complete the research first," she says slowly, "and possibly undertake further, better planned explorations of the cave system and its connection to the burial mound. But yes, the idea has merit. Perhaps good can yet come from my foolish adventure." "Not foolish," Holmes corrects gently, "merely inadequately prepared. There is a difference, and recognizing that difference is essential for anyone who wishes to pursue truth in places where it does not readily reveal itself. Now, however, I believe it is time to return to your home, to allow your parents to fuss over you properly, and to let Dr. Watson conduct a thorough medical examination to ensure that 3 days of inadequate nutrition and exposure have not created any lasting harm." The return to the Pemberton house occurs in a small procession, the family reunited, Holmes and Watson walking slightly behind, Dr. Cavendish accompanying them, still chattering with excitement about the cave system and its implications for understanding the burial mound's original purpose and use. The villagers who had watched their earlier passage now emerge from houses to witness the return, their faces showing confusion and relief in equal measure, clearly having expected different news, darker conclusions. Meredith, his arm around his daughter's shoulders, stops periodically to address those who call out questions, explaining in clear, simple terms that Bronwyn had been exploring the cave system as part of her research, had become trapped by tidal flows, and had wisely chosen to wait for rescue rather than risk the dangerous passages in darkness. No goddesses, no supernatural intervention, no curses or vengeance, merely a young woman's academic curiosity, leading her into natural danger from which she had been successfully retrieved. Watson watches the villagers' faces as they process this explanation, sees how some accept it with relief, while others seem almost disappointed, as though they had been hoping for supernatural drama, for confirmation of their beliefs and traditions. But all show genuine gladness that Bronwyn is safe, that the Pemberton family's ordeal has ended happily. and this shared relief creates a softening in the atmosphere, a reduction in the tension that had characterized the village since the excavation began. They reach the Pemberton house, and Caris immediately begins organizing. Hot baths, fresh clothes, food, all the domestic machinery of care asserting itself, now that crisis has yielded to resolution. Watson conducts his examination of Bronwyn in her room, the same room from which she had vanished 3 days earlier, checking her vital signs, her reflexes, looking for any indication of injury or illness beyond the obvious exhaustion and malnutrition. "You are remarkably fortunate," he tells her when the examination is complete. 3 days in those conditions could easily have resulted in hypothermia, serious dehydration, or any number of complications. That you are merely tired and hungry speaks to both your good general health and your presence of mind in rationing the supplies you found. "I'm a surveyor's daughter," Bronwyn replies with a slight smile. Father has always emphasized that proper planning and resource management are the difference between successful projects and disasters. I applied those principles to surviving in the cave, treating it as a project with specific goals and constraints, rather than panicking at being trapped. "Nevertheless," he says firmly, "you are to rest completely for at least 3 days. Eat regular meals, however little appetite you feel, and submit to being fussed over by your mother, who has earned the right to fuss after what you've put her through. Doctor's orders, not subject to debate or negotiation." "Yes, Dr. Watson," she agrees meekly, though her eyes sparkle with humor that suggests she will be a difficult patient, will probably be up and about far sooner than Watson would prefer, will already be planning her next research project before her current adventure has fully concluded. He leaves her to her mother's care and descends the stairs to find Holmes in the sitting room with Meredith. The two men engaged in quiet conversation that stops when Watson enters. "Ah, Watson," Holmes says, rising from his chair with visible effort. "I have been explaining to Mr. Pemberton that while his daughter's adventure has resolved happily, the underlying issues that precipitated it have not been addressed. The excavation continues to disturb the village's peace, and until that work is complete, or until some accommodation is reached between progress and tradition, tensions will remain high." Meredith nods wearily, his face showing the accumulated strain of the past days. "I have been considering this very question, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Cavendish has suggested that rather than simply bulldozing through the burial mound to create the railway cutting, we might instead route the line slightly to the north, preserving the mound itself while still achieving the necessary connection. The cost would be marginally higher, the timeline extended perhaps by several months, but the social benefit, the reduction in conflict and distress, might well be worth the additional investment." "A wise consideration," Holmes agrees, "and one that I would recommend you pursue. Bronwyn's research has demonstrated that these ancient sites contain genuine historical and cultural significance, that dismissing them as mere superstition is both inaccurate and, from a practical standpoint, socially destructive. Better to find ways to accommodate both modern needs and traditional values than to insist on one at the expense of the other." They speak for a while longer, working through implications and possibilities. But Watson can see exhaustion overtaking his friend, can recognize the signs of someone who has pushed beyond reasonable limits and must soon rest or face collapse. He intervenes gently but firmly, thanking Meredith for his hospitality and explaining that they must find lodging in the village, must rest before undertaking the return journey to London. Meredith insists they stay as his guests, but Watson demurs, knowing that this household needs time and space to reunite as a family, to process the emotions of the past days without the presence of strangers, however helpful those strangers have been. They agree instead to accept dinner with the family later that evening, and Meredith directs them to the village's small inn, promising that he will ensure their accommodation is comfortable, and that their bill will be paid by the family in gratitude for services rendered. The walk to the inn is short, and the innkeeper, clearly having heard of their role in finding Bronwyn, greets them with warmth and immediately shows them to the establishment's best room, small but clean, with 2 beds and a window overlooking the village square. Holmes collapses onto one bed almost immediately, not bothering to remove more than his shoes, and Watson watches his friend's face relax into sleep with a speed that indicates absolute exhaustion. Watson himself is tired, but he takes time to properly prepare for rest, removing his filthy clothes, washing as best he can with the basin and pitcher provided, changing into the clean shirt from his valise. He unpacks their minimal belongings, arranges things with the order that his military training instilled, and only then allows himself to lie down on the second bed, feeling his own body's accumulated weariness finally asserting its claims. Through the window, he can hear the village returning to its normal rhythms, the sounds of daily life resuming after the disruption of crisis and mystery. Voices call greetings, a dog barks, somewhere a cart rattles along the street. These ordinary sounds blend into a symphony of normalcy that lulls Watson into sleep, into dreams that are fragmentary and confused, but not unpleasant. The kind of dreams that come when the mind processes recent experiences, sorting and filing memories into appropriate categories before releasing consciousness entirely. He wakes to find the afternoon has advanced into evening. The light through the window deepened to golden as the invisible sun approaches the horizon, somewhere beyond the persistent clouds. Holmes still sleeps, his breathing deep and regular, and Watson decides to let him rest as long as his body requires, understanding that the past weeks have demanded more than is sustainable, that his friend's remarkable constitution has limits that must be respected. Watson descends to the inn's common room and finds it fuller than earlier, occupied by villagers taking their evening meal, their conversations creating a warm buzz of human sociability. The innkeeper sees him and immediately brings food, hearty stew and fresh bread, local cheese and beer, and Watson eats slowly, listening to the conversations around him, to the way the villagers are already constructing narratives about the day's events, about the London detective and the brave young woman and the cave passage that proved the old legends true. The stories shift and change with each telling, details added or altered, and Watson reflects on how quickly truth becomes story, how the actual events that he and Holmes experienced directly are already being transformed into something more dramatic, more satisfying as narrative, less accurate as history. By tomorrow, he suspects, the tale will include elements they would not recognize, will have grown more colourful and unlikely, will have begun its transformation into the very kind of legend that brought them here in the first place. Dr. Cavendish enters the inn, spots Watson, and joins him with evident pleasure at having someone to discuss the day's discoveries with. Extraordinary, he enthuses, settling into the chair across from Watson, and immediately launching into analysis. The implications for our understanding of Bronze Age religious practices, the clear evidence of continuous use of the site, the way natural cave systems were incorporated into artificial burial structures. Watson, this is the kind of discovery that careers are built on, that fundamentally shifts how we understand ancient cultures. Watson listens patiently, asking appropriate questions, allowing Cavendish to process his excitement through conversation, and finds himself genuinely interested in the archaeological implications that he had not previously considered. The intersection of natural and artificial, of geology and human construction, of practical function and religious symbolism. It is indeed fascinating, this evidence of how ancient peoples thought about and interacted with their landscape. Eventually, Cavendish's initial enthusiasm spent, they settle into more reflective conversation, discussing how the excavation might proceed differently now, how Bronwyn's research might be incorporated into formal archaeological documentation, how the village's concerns might be balanced with the need to complete the railway connection. It is pleasant conversation, the kind that makes time pass unnoticed, and Watson is surprised when the innkeeper announces that it is nearly time for them to attend dinner at the Pemberton house, that the hour has advanced while they talked. He excuses himself and returns upstairs to find Holmes awake, significantly refreshed, though still showing signs of tiredness. "I slept like the dead," Holmes announces, his voice stronger than earlier, "and I feel remarkably improved for it. Watson, you are absolutely correct to insist on rest, though I hate to admit it. Now, however, we must prepare for this dinner, play our social roles appropriately, and then tomorrow we can return to London satisfied that we have fulfilled our obligations to the Pemberton family and to the cause of reason over superstition." They dress in their least dishevelled clothes, make themselves as presentable as possible under the circumstances, and walk through the village to the Pemberton house as evening deepens into night. The clouds have finally begun to break, allowing glimpses of stars between their ragged edges, and the air has that particular clarity that comes after prolonged rain, as though the world has been washed clean and returned to its essential self. Caris Pemberton greets them at the door, her face transformed from the haggard worry of earlier to something approaching joy, and she ushers them into the dining room, where the table has been set with evident care, where candles burn in multiple holders, casting warm light across good china and simple but abundant food. The family is there, Meredith and Gareth and Bronwyn, and they rise as Holmes and Watson enter, and for a moment the atmosphere holds a quality of formality, of ritual, as though this meal is less about consumption of food than about acknowledgement of debts and bonds formed through shared crisis. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Meredith says, his voice carrying emotion barely controlled. "Please sit. You have restored our daughter to us, solved the mystery that threatened to tear our family and our village apart, and demonstrated that reason and compassion together can overcome even the most perplexing circumstances. We can never adequately repay such gifts, but we can at least offer you a meal and our deepest gratitude." The dinner that follows is among the most pleasant Watson has experienced in months. Simple food, but abundant and well prepared. Conversation that ranges across multiple topics, but returns always to Bronwyn's research and discoveries, her plans for future work, the tentative agreement Meredith has reached with the railway company to modify the excavation plans. there is laughter around this table. The kind of laughter that comes from relief and release, from fear transformed into safety, from crisis resolved through cooperation and courage. Bronwyn herself, though still weak and clearly tired, participates actively in the conversation, her mind as engaged as ever, already planning her next research projects. Though Watson has explicitly ordered her to rest, she and Holmes fall into an extended discussion about methodology, about the proper balance between respect for traditional knowledge and rigorous empirical investigation, about how one might conduct research that honors both scientific method and cultural sensitivity. Watching them, Watson feels profound satisfaction at this outcome, at the way tragedy has been averted, understanding deepened, relationships formed between people who might otherwise never have encountered each other. This, he reflects, is what the work is actually about. Not the drama or excitement, or even the intellectual satisfaction of solving puzzles, but the human connections formed, the lives improved, the small victories against chaos and confusion that accumulate over time into something meaningful. The evening extends later than Watson had anticipated, time moving in that pleasant way it does when company is congenial, and no one wishes to break the spell by acknowledging the hour. Eventually, though, Bronwyn's exhaustion becomes evident, and Watson insists that she must rest, that conversation, however stimulating, is less important than allowing her body to recover from its ordeal. They take their leave with warmth and repeated thanks, promises to correspond, invitations to return should they ever find themselves in Gower again. The walk back to the inn occurs in comfortable silence, Holmes and Watson side by side, moving through the village that now feels less foreign, less suspicious of their presence, more welcoming because they have proven themselves through action rather than through credentials or reputation. At the inn, they climb the stairs to their small room, prepare for sleep with the easy coordination of long familiarity. And Watson is aware, as he settles into bed, of profound tiredness, but also profound contentment, the kind of satisfaction that comes from work well done, from good outcomes achieved through effort and risk. Holmes, he says into the darkness, because some things must be said before sleep claims them. That was good work today, brilliant work. You saved that young woman's life. We saved her life, Holmes corrects quietly from his own bed. You were there every step of the way, Watson, in the cave passages, supporting and encouraging and ensuring that we did not proceed beyond safe limits. And before that, you made the decision to wake me despite my need for rest, recognizing that the case could not wait for my convenience. These were judgments that required wisdom and courage, and I am fortunate beyond measure to have a friend and colleague who possesses both in abundance. Watson feels warmth spreading through him at these words, at this rare explicit acknowledgement from a man who usually expresses appreciation through implication rather than statement. Thank you, he says simply, and means it in ways that extend far beyond this single case, this single adventure, encompassing instead their entire long partnership, all the cases and crises and midnight consultations, all the moments of danger and discovery that have bound them together into something deeper than mere friendship, something approaching brotherhood. Sleep now, Holmes says, his voice already thickening with the approach of unconsciousness. Tomorrow we return to London, to 221B and Mrs. Hudson, and whatever new mysteries await. But tonight, rest and satisfaction, and the knowledge that we have done what we set out to do. And Watson does sleep, deeply and dreamlessly, while outside the stars continue their slow procession across the sky, while the village of Lanmedoc settles into its own peaceful sleep, while the ancient stones stand silent in the darkness, keeping their secrets and their memories, bearing witness to another generation of humans working through their mysteries in the shadow of ages past. Morning arrives with genuine sunshine, the first Watson has seen since their arrival, breaking through the clouds in shafts of golden light that transform the landscape, revealing colours and contours that had been muted by days of grey. They breakfast at the inn, hearty porridge and eggs, strong tea, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and prepare for their departure with mixed feelings, reluctant to leave this place that has claimed so much of their attention and energy, but also eager to return home, to the familiar comforts of 221B and the regular rhythms of London life. Meredith arrives with a carriage to take them to Swansea, insisting despite their protests that they must accept this small service, that it is the least he can do given what they have done for his family. Bronwyn appears briefly to see them off, still pale but visibly stronger, her eyes clear and alert, her mind already working on the essay Holmes had suggested she write. "Thank you again," she tells them, shaking hands with formal sincerity. "Not just for finding me, though, of course, that was rather important, but for understanding what I was attempting, for not dismissing my research as foolish or misguided. Mr. Holmes, I will write that essay, and when it is complete, I will send you a copy. Perhaps you might even comment on it, provide feedback from your own investigative perspective." "I would be honoured," Holmes replies, and Watson can hear genuine respect in his friend's voice, recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who pursues truth regardless of personal cost or social convention. "And Miss Pemberton, might I suggest that in your future research endeavours you consider taking a companion, not because you lack courage or capability, but because all exploration, whether physical or intellectual, benefits from collaboration, from having another perspective, another set of eyes, another mind to consult when circumstances become unclear or dangerous." Bronwyn nods thoughtfully, clearly taking this advice seriously. "My brother Gareth has expressed interest in assisting with my future work. He lacks my academic training, but possesses good practical sense and considerable courage. And you are right that I should not undertake such explorations alone. Consider your advice taken, Mr. Holmes." The farewells complete, they climb into the carriage and begin the journey back to Swansea, retracing the route they had travelled in darkness and rain just 2 days earlier. Though it feels longer, feels as though weeks have passed since they arrived in response to Gareth's desperate request for help. The landscape that had been obscured by grey mist now reveals itself in full detail. Rolling green hills, stone walls marking ancient field boundaries, sheep grazing in morning sunlight, the distant shimmer of the sea, and there, clearly visible now, the standing stones and the burial mound, the places where Bronze Age peoples had marked their landscape with meaning that still resonates millennia later. They ride in comfortable silence, watching the countryside pass, each absorbed in their own thoughts about the case just concluded, about the lessons learned, about the way that investigation so often reveals complexities beneath apparent simplicity, rational explanations beneath supernatural appearance. I suspected that any apparently impossible situation must have a possible explanation, Holmes clarifies, because impossibility is generally illusion, a failure to observe all relevant factors, rather than genuine violation of physical law. The locked door and window suggested either that Bronwyn had never left the room, that she was hidden somewhere within it, perhaps injured or ill, or that there was another exit we were not initially aware of. The existence of cave systems, the legends of passages between the barrow and the sea, Bronwyn's own research into these topics, all suggested that the second possibility was more likely, that she had found and used a passage unknown to her family. But you could not have been certain, Watson presses. Yet you proceeded as though you knew, rather than merely suspected. Certainty comes only after investigation, Holmes replies. But direction for investigation must come from probability and inference, from constructing the most likely scenario given available evidence, and then testing that scenario against reality. I could not be certain until we actually found Bronwyn in the cave, but I could be reasonably confident that we would find her there rather than somewhere else, because all the evidence pointed in that direction once one knew how to read it. They fall silent again, and Watson reflects on this explanation, on the way Holmes's mind works, simultaneously logical and intuitive, building structures of understanding that seem inevitable once constructed, but which require remarkable insight to build in the first place. It is a gift, Watson knows, this ability to see patterns that others miss, to connect disparate pieces of information into coherent narratives, to penetrate mystery through observation and reasoning. The journey to Swansea passes quickly, and they arrive with time to spare before the London train's departure. They thank Meredith's driver, purchase their tickets, and settle into a first-class compartment for the long journey home. As the train pulls out of the station, as Wales begins to give way to the English countryside beyond, Watson feels the particular sensation of transition, of one chapter closing and another preparing to open, of movement between worlds that remain connected but separate. Holmes has already pulled out Bronwyn's journal, the one they had preserved from the cave, and is reading through it carefully, making occasional notes in his own small notebook, clearly finding material of interest in her observations and deductions. Watson watches him for a moment, then pulls out his own notebook and begins to write, recording the case while details remain fresh, beginning the process of transforming experience into narrative, into one more chronicle of the strange adventures that define their partnership. The train rushes through the afternoon, carrying them toward London, toward home, toward whatever new mysteries await their attention. And Watson writes, occasionally pausing to stare out the window at the passing landscape, occasionally consulting Holmes about some detail or sequence of events, gradually constructing the story that will eventually be titled The Adventure of the Morrigan's Warning, or perhaps The Case of the Locked Room and the Ancient Passage, some name that will capture the essence of what they experienced without revealing too much, that will protect the Pemberton family's privacy while sharing the lessons the case taught. As evening approaches and the train nears London, Holmes sets aside Bronwyn's journal and speaks quietly about the case, about what it taught him, about the persistence of ancient knowledge, about the way that legends often encode real information in metaphorical form, about the importance of listening to traditional wisdom, even while applying modern analytical methods. The village elders were not wrong to say that the Morrigan had taken Bronwyn, he observes, his tone thoughtful. They were simply using metaphorical language to describe a real phenomenon, that ancient sacred sites exert attraction, that those who study them can become obsessed, drawn into them physically and psychologically in ways that create risk. Bronwyn was taken not by a supernatural goddess, but by her own intellectual curiosity, by the compelling pull of mystery and the desire to understand. The elders understood this dynamic through their cultural framework, while we understand it through psychological and rational frameworks. Different languages describing the same essential truth. There is often wisdom in what we dismiss as superstition, Holmes confirms. The challenge is to distinguish between the wisdom and the embellishment, between the core of truth and the layers of interpretation that accumulate over generations. This requires neither blind acceptance of tradition nor arrogant dismissal of it, but careful, respectful investigation that seeks to understand what experience lies beneath the mythological expression. Watson considers this, recognizing it as a significant philosophical development in his friend's usually rigorously rational worldview, an acknowledgement that not all knowledge can be reduced to empirical observation, that some truths require different frameworks for understanding, different languages for expression. The train pulls into Paddington Station as full darkness falls, and they disembark into the familiar chaos of London, crowds and noise, and the complex cacophony of the great city going about its endless business. They hire a cab, and as they ride through the gaslit streets toward Baker Street, Watson feels profound relief at returning home, at the prospect of sleeping in his own bed, of resuming the comfortable routines that had been interrupted by Gareth's desperate appeal for help. The cab stops before the familiar doorway of 221B, and they climb out, gathering their luggage, mounting the steps that have become so familiar that Watson could navigate them blindfolded. The door opens before they can knock. Mrs. Hudson has heard their arrival, has been waiting for their return, and her face shows relief and welcome, and the particular satisfaction of someone whose household is once again complete. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, welcome home. I've kept the fire burning, and there's fresh tea, and I've prepared a late supper if you're hungry. Was your journey successful? Did you find the young woman? We found her, Mrs. Hudson, Watson assures her warmly, safe and well, and we've restored her to her grateful family. The case is concluded successfully, and we are immensely glad to be home. They climb the familiar stairs to the sitting room, and Watson feels emotion rising unexpectedly as they enter. This space that has witnessed so many beginnings and endings, so many cases concluded and new mysteries begun, so many late nights and urgent consultations, has become more than simply a room, has become the physical expression of their partnership, their friendship, their shared commitment to bringing order from chaos, understanding from confusion. Holmes moves immediately to his chair, settling into it with a sigh of deep contentment, and Watson takes his own seat, the two of them falling naturally into their accustomed positions as though they had never left, as though the past days in Wales had been dream rather than reality. Mrs. Hudson brings tea and sandwiches, fussing appropriately about their appearance and the evident hardships they have endured, and they accept her care with gratitude, understanding that this too is part of the pattern, part of the ritual of departure and return that structures their lives. No new cases have arrived in your absence, Mrs. Hudson reports as she arranges the tea things. Though several letters did come, which I've left on your desk, Mr. Holmes. Nothing that appeared urgent, but you'll want to review them when you have opportunity. Tomorrow, Holmes says firmly. Tonight is for rest and tea and the particular pleasure of being home after adventures in the provinces. Tomorrow will be soon enough for new cases, new mysteries, new calls to action. Mrs. Hudson smiles and withdraws, leaving them to their quiet reunion with familiar space. They drink their tea in comfortable silence, too tired for extended conversation, simply existing in each other's presence, and in the presence of this room that knows them better than anywhere else in the world. Eventually, Watson rouses himself enough to speak. I'm going to bed properly, in an actual bed, and I'm going to sleep until my body decides to wake up, rather than until some new crisis demands attention. I recommend you do the same. Sound advice, Holmes agrees, though he makes no immediate move to follow it. Simply continues sitting in his chair, gazing into the fire, clearly processing the case, turning it over in his mind, examining it from multiple angles before filing it away in whatever mental archive he maintains. Watson leaves him to this contemplation and retreats to his own room, small but comfortable, familiar in every detail. He prepares for bed with the care of someone too tired to rush, and as he finally settles under the covers, as his body begins to release its accumulated tension, he reflects on the case just concluded, on the young woman saved and the family reunited, on the locked room, mystery solved, and the ancient passage discovered. But more than the details of the investigation, he thinks about friendship and partnership, about having someone to face darkness with, about the profound comfort of being known and accepted in all one's peculiarities and limitations. He thinks about Holmes sleeping in the next room, about Mrs. Hudson downstairs maintaining the household, about this small community they have formed, these three people bound together by affection and need, and the accumulated history of shared experience. And as sleep claims him, as consciousness fades into dreams, Watson's last thought is one of gratitude for this place, these people, this life that somehow, against all odds and expectations, provides meaning and purpose, and the particular kind of happiness that comes not from absence of challenge, but from facing challenges alongside others who share your values and vision. The night deepens over London, over Baker Street, over 221B, where two men sleep, the sleep of honest exhaustion after work well done, where tomorrow will bring new mysteries and new challenges, but where tonight brings only peace and rest and the quiet satisfaction of being home. In the days that follow their return from Wales, life at 221B settles back into its familiar rhythms, or rather, into the particular kind of unfamiliar familiarity that characterizes existence in that household, where routine is always subject to disruption by the arrival of unusual clients bearing strange problems, requiring immediate attention. But for a brief period, a pocket of quiet that Watson recognizes as temporary, but appreciates nonetheless. There is space for rest and recovery, for processing recent experiences, for the ordinary domestic activities that provide necessary foundation for extraordinary adventures. Watson, for his part, works on his narrative of the Welsh case, transforming his rough notes into coherent prose, making decisions about what to include and what to omit, how to present Bronwyn's story in ways that protect her privacy while capturing the case's essential lessons. He finds the writing process therapeutic, a way of understanding his own reactions to events, of creating meaning through narrative structure. Mrs. Hudson maintains her domain below, occasionally appearing with meals or tea or gentle commentary about the state of the sitting room's carpets, which have suffered from Holmes's chemical experiments. But her complaints are pro forma, ritual rather than genuine criticism, part of the comfortable dance they all perform around each other's eccentricities and needs. Letters arrive, as Mrs. Hudson had mentioned, and Holmes reviews them with varying degrees of interest. A request from a government minister regarding a sensitive matter of state security, which Holmes agrees to consider. An inquiry from a wealthy widow whose diamond bracelet has vanished, which Holmes declines as insufficiently interesting. Several letters from admiring readers of Watson's chronicles, which Holmes reads with amusement and hands to Watson for his own review and response. And there is a letter from Wales, from Bronwyn Pemberton, reporting on her recovery and thanking them again for their assistance, including early notes toward the essay she is planning about the intersection of archaeology and folklore. Holmes reads this letter aloud, clearly pleased by Bronwyn's continued intellectual engagement with her experience, and they discuss her ideas, her approach, her conclusions about what the cave passage and the burial mound reveal about Bronze Age religious practices. She has a genuine gift for synthesis, Holmes observes, setting down the letter. The ability to hold multiple frameworks simultaneously, to see how they complement, rather than contradict each other. Such intellectual flexibility is rare, Watson, and I am glad that her adventure in the caves has not dampened her enthusiasm for research, only taught her to conduct that research more carefully. Days pass in this gentle manner, autumn deepening toward winter, the London rain that had accompanied their initial journey to Wales finally clearing to reveal cold, bright November days, the kind where the sun is brilliant but provides no warmth, where breath fogs in the air and frost persists in shadowed corners, long after the sun has risen. One evening, perhaps a week after their return, as they sit by the fire after dinner, Watson reading and Holmes playing slow, meditative music on his violin, a knock comes at the door. Not Mrs. Hudson's familiar tap, but a visitor's knock, sharp and somewhat tentative. Mrs. Hudson appears a moment later, her expression curious. "A young man to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says his name is Gareth Pemberton, that you'll remember him from Wales." Holmes and Watson exchange surprised glances. They had not expected Gareth to make the journey to London, but Holmes sets down his violin immediately and calls for the visitor to be shown up. Gareth appears in the doorway, hat in hand, his manner uncertain but determined, and Holmes rises to greet him warmly. "Gareth, this is unexpected. Come in, sit, tell us what brings you to London. Is something wrong? Is your sister well?" "Bronwyn is fine," Gareth assures them quickly, settling nervously into the chair Holmes indicates. "Better than fine, actually. She's been working on her essay, interviewing village elders, spending hours at the small library. Dr. Cavendish has agreed to collaborate with her, to provide the archaeological perspective while she handles the folkloristic analysis. It's quite exciting, really, watching her transform her adventure into intellectual contribution." "Then what brings you here?" Watson asks, gently, because the young man is clearly building up to something, working his courage up to state his purpose. Gareth takes a deep breath settles his shoulders and speaks in a rush. "I want to apprentice with you, Mr. Holmes. I want to learn investigation, detection, the methods you use to solve mysteries. I know I'm not brilliant like you. I don't have your remarkable abilities of observation and deduction. But I'm willing to work hard, to learn, to do whatever menial tasks might be required in exchange for being allowed to observe, to understand your methods, to develop my own capabilities." He stops, slightly breathless, and looks between them with an expression mixing hope and fear, clearly expecting rejection, but hoping desperately for acceptance. Holmes regards him thoughtfully, his fingers steepling beneath his chin in his characteristic gesture of contemplation. And Watson can see his friend considering, evaluating, working through implications and possibilities. "Why?" Holmes asks simply. "You are young, educated, presumably with many paths available to you. Why seek this particular path? What draws you to detective work?" It is a good answer, Watson thinks, honest and thoughtful, showing self-awareness about limitations, while also demonstrating genuine interest and motivation. He glances at Holmes, trying to read whether his friend is considering this seriously or preparing a gentle rejection. "I do not take apprentices," Holmes says finally, and Watson sees disappointment flash across Gareth's face before Holmes continues. "I work alone, or rather, I work with Watson, whose presence is essential precisely because he is not an apprentice, but an equal partner, someone who brings different skills and perspectives that complement rather than duplicate my own. I could not teach you to be me, Gareth, and I would not wish to, because there are already too few authentic individuals in the world, and too many people trying to become copies of others." "I understand," Gareth says quietly, rising to leave, defeated but trying to maintain dignity. "Yes," Gareth breathes, his face transforming with relief and excitement. "Yes, absolutely. Whatever terms you think appropriate. I would be grateful for any opportunity to learn." Holmes smiles, something almost paternal in his expression, and Watson realizes his friend is pleased by this request, flattered, but also genuinely interested in the possibility of sharing knowledge, of contributing to another person's intellectual development. They discuss practicalities. Gareth will need to find employment in London, as his family cannot support him indefinitely. He will need lodging near enough to Baker Street that he can respond when summoned, but not so close as to be constantly underfoot. There will be no guarantee of regular involvement in cases, only the possibility of occasional participation when circumstances allow. Gareth accepts all conditions eagerly, clearly willing to make whatever arrangements necessary to pursue this opportunity. And Watson finds himself warming to the young man, appreciating his enthusiasm and determination, seeing in him something of his younger self, the person he was before Afghanistan and injury, and the chance encounter with Sherlock Holmes that transformed his life's trajectory. They spend the evening in pleasant conversation, Gareth asking questions about previous cases, Holmes selectively answering while also deflecting inquiries that would violate client confidentiality. The three of them gradually establishing the foundations of what might become a productive relationship, might extend their small community by one more person, might add complexity and richness to the work they do together. When Gareth finally takes his leave, promising to write once he has secured employment and lodging, Holmes sees him to the door with unusual warmth, then returns to his chair by the fire with an expression Watson finds difficult to read. Satisfaction mixed with something else. Perhaps the recognition of mortality, of the passage of time, of the fact that knowledge must be shared if it is to survive beyond its original holder. "That was kind of you," Watson observes quietly. "You can frame it however you like," Watson says with a smile. "But I watched your face as you spoke with him, and I know kindness when I see it, whatever other motivations might also be present." Holmes harumphs, but does not argue further, turning his attention to the fire. And they sit in comfortable silence as the evening deepens into night, as the household settles into sleep, as London continues its restless existence beyond their windows. And Watson thinks about continuity and change, about how knowledge passes from generation to generation, about how each of us is shaped by those who came before, while simultaneously shaping those who come after. He thinks about the cases they have solved, the people they have helped, the small victories against darkness and confusion that accumulate over years into something that might, if one is optimistic, be called progress. The fire burns low, requiring attention, and Watson rises to add coal, performing the small domestic ritual that maintains warmth against the November night. Holmes watches him, his remarkable eyes reflecting firelight, and Watson feels profound gratitude for this friendship, this partnership, this shared life that has given him purpose and meaning beyond anything he could have imagined in his younger years. "We should sleep," Watson says eventually, "because the hour is late, and tomorrow will bring its own demands, its own challenges and opportunities." "Yes," Holmes agrees, but neither man moves immediately, both reluctant to break the spell of this moment, this quiet evening that somehow feels significant, that seems to mark transition from one phase to another, though neither could articulate precisely what is ending or what is beginning. Finally, they rouse themselves and prepare for bed, moving through their nighttime routines with the automaticity of long habit. Watson retreats to his room, hearing Holmes doing the same, and as he settles under the covers, as consciousness begins its slow dissolution into sleep, he reflects on the strange circularity of life, how endings loop back to beginnings, how solving one mystery invariably reveals others waiting to be explored. The case of Bronwyn Pemberton is complete, filed away in memory and manuscript, but its effects continue to ripple outward. A young woman pursuing new research, a young man seeking new purpose, two middle-aged men reminded that the work they do matters, that investigation is not merely intellectual exercise, but service to others, contribution to the slow, difficult project of replacing confusion with understanding, fear with knowledge, darkness with whatever light human effort can generate. And on this thought, peaceful and affirming, Watson falls asleep, while rain begins again to whisper against the windows, while London sleeps and wakes and sleeps again, while the world turns slowly through its ancient dance. And at 221 B. Baker Street, two friends rest, gathering strength for whatever mysteries tomorrow will bring. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey tonight, dear friend. I hope this story has helped your thoughts slow down, has given your mind something gentle to hold on to as you drift towards sleep. If you enjoyed this atmospheric mystery, if the combination of Victorian London, Gothic intrigue, and soothing narration helped you relax, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps others find these sleep stories when they need them most. But more importantly than any of that, I hope you sleep well tonight. I hope you dream of gaslit streets and gentle rain, of mysteries solved and families reunited, of friendship that endures through danger and difficulty. I hope you wake tomorrow refreshed and ready for whatever your own adventures might bring, carrying with you the knowledge that even the most perplexing mysteries have solutions, that even locked rooms have exits if we know where to look, that courage and curiosity and compassion together can overcome tremendous challenges. Rest well, wherever you are in this wide world. Let the sound of rain and the glow of firelight accompany you into peaceful sleep. And remember that tomorrow is always another opportunity to begin again, to investigate the mysteries of your own life with the same dedication and care that Holmes brings to his cases, with the same loyalty and wisdom that Watson brings to his friendship. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be filled with wonder, your sleep deep and restorative, and your tomorrow bright with possibility. Until we meet again for another story, another mystery, another journey into the past, where gaslight flickers and great minds work to bring order from chaos. I wish you peace, rest, and the quiet satisfaction of a day completed and a night begun. Sleep well, and good night.